Two guys are standing on a grassy hill and looking at the wide open spaces. A guy with brown hair is holding a shovel, and a guy with white hair is holding a flag. Four weird little animals are sitting at their feet. The white flag with symbols is fluttering in the wind. The brunette is happy and smiles and looks into the distance, while his friend is calm. The little animals are charged with energy. The brunette mentally greets the viewer and says that his name is Kim Soo-ho. The little animals are shouting out sounds one by one. The hero corrects himself and says that here his name is Lloyd Frontera. The hero swings his shovel with a smile and says that here. The hero plunges the shovel into the ground. The ground under the hero's feet begins to glow and a large blue circle appears under him, lined with a checkered pattern. The circle begins to expand and all the surroundings around the heroes turn into a blue checkered field. A model of skyscrapers begins to appear above the ground from glowing lines. The hero says that this is the story of an ordinary civil engineer. The vast expanses begin to turn into a model of a city with skyscrapers. The hero continues that this builder has completely changed the world. The hero looks at the model of the city spread out under the mountains. He addresses his partner by the name Xavier, to which Xavier calmly responds with the words, "Yes, Mr. Lloyd." Lloyd spreads his arms in a crazy smile and shouts that it is all money. Mr. Lloyd laughs loudly, to which Xavier asks if his master has gone crazy. A medieval town at night, several years ago. A notification appeared that the hero had chosen the absolute and that he could make a wish. A congratulation appeared. The guy lay on the ground dissatisfied and looked at the congratulations. The notification said that he had become one of the heroes of the novel The Knight of Iron and Blood. He recognized this novel because he read it yesterday. The hero was asked to try hard and wish good luck in the message. He did not understand what wish and what request were being discussed, did not understand why he was imagining it, because he was not even drunk. The hero opened his mouth in surprise. The thought came to him that perhaps this was a migration into a body from another world, which often appears in web novels. The hero assumed that he ended up in another world. The hero was lying in the middle of the road leading to the city. He did not understand why he woke up, having fallen to the ground. He convulsively got up and complained about the night cold. The guy's mouth shifted to the side and was cartoonishly small, which caused him reasonable surprise. A red notification bar appeared. It said that the mouth was crooked as a result of sleeping on the street. The guy slapped the notification window with displeasure, annoyed by his style of speaking. He adjusted his mouth and said that he had moved into the body of the hero of the novel, wondering who he had become in this novel. The hero called himself a man living in a village and sleeping on the road. Someone called out Mr. Lloyd and the guy turned thoughtfully. An unknown figure approached the surprised brunette. The man said that he had been looking for him for a long time. A golden sword guard peeked out from behind his belt. The man's hair was silver like the moon. A calm guy in a blue semblance of a uniform stood in front of the hero and asked him to return to the mansion. This was the main character of the novel, Xavier. The brunette broke out in a cold sweat. In his thoughts he noted that Xavier was the same as in the pictures of the novel. He noticed that he was addressed by the name of Lloyd. Xavier in a cloak and with a glowing sword. He was a sword master who, as the plot of the novel developed, became famous throughout the continent, but at the beginning of the novel he was only a knight guarding the Baron, whose eldest son's name was. The hero suddenly realized who he was and screamed, was he really that prankster Lloyd Frontera? Xavier looked calmly at the flushed boy. A slight surprise touched his face and he said that he did not call the boy a prankster, only called him by name. Xavier smiled slightly and said, well, that Lloyd correctly assessed himself. The notification reported that Xavier looked pleased, to which Lloyd mentally asked the notification to shut up. In front of the heroes was a large two-story mansion in the night. Xavier stirred the wood in the fireplace and asked the hero if he remembered how he ended up on the road. Lloyd sat wrapped in a warm blanket while Xavier explained to him that Lloyd had been drinking since dinner and broke all the dishes in the tavern, then got homesick and fell asleep on the way. In his mind, Lloyd noted that this was expected on the day of the prankster. Xavier continued to explain that the Baron was worried about his son and sent him away. He noted that even if the son was a prankster, the Baron would be sad if his son died on the street with a crooked mouth. Lloyd noted that Xavier spoke without any fear. Lloyd felt the floor and dreamed of a heated floor, but suddenly realized that he was in a medieval fantasy. Xavier turned around and told the hero to rest and said that he would report to the Baron about his tricks tomorrow morning, to which Lloyd asked not to tell and immediately received a negative answer. Xavier was impenetrable, like a wall. Xavier had already opened the door as Lloyd turned to him. The guy with a strange smile asked if they had much light at home. Xavier closed his eyes, surprised by the strange words. He slammed the door behind him without answering. The hero silently thought he knew the entire content of this novel. In his world, lying in a narrow room, finishing reading the last chapter on his phone, he knew the fate of his character. On the cold floor, the pale hands of the Baron and his wife lay on top of each other. The hero knew that at the very beginning of the novel they fell for vile swindlers, lost all their fortune and committed suicide. Lloyd was lying drunk on the table and asking to be served alcohol. After killing his parents, he began to beg and drink non-stop. Lloyd vomited blood and held his throat. Dropping the mug, he died. The guy threw off the blanket and screamed that even if he had become an aristocrat, his life was as worthless as in Korea. He mentally turned to the Absolute, remembered the notification sign, tried to understand what it was up to. He did not understand why he had stuck it in this body. Morning came and the town under the mountains was illuminated by the sun. The white walls of the mansion shone in the sun. Xavier walked calmly behind the lady in the white dress, who was clarifying what Lloyd had done in the tavern last night. It was his mother named Marbella Frontera. Lloyd stood there shabby and realized that he had actually read a novel yesterday. An agitated Marbella asked her son to go and apologize to her. Lloyd did not let his mother finish and immediately agreed, guiltily scratching the back of his head. He understood that he was responsible for the pogrom that his body had committed yesterday. Marbella and even Xavier suddenly opened their eyes in surprise, which was noticed by the pop-up notification. The hero did not understand. Should he not be at least a little proud of him? The sky above the medieval houses was clear and calm. A man was putting bales of straw into a cart. Something caught his attention. Xavier and Lloyd were approaching him along the street along the barrels and windows. The frightened man immediately hid behind his cart, not even thinking to look in the direction of those walking. Lloyd looked at him questioningly. All the passers-by on the street shuddered and ran in different directions, only noticing Lloyd with his companion. The surprise on Lloyd's face only grew. The little boy looked at the walking couple with curiosity. Then he was pulled inside the house with the words that he must not look at him. The window sashes slammed shut. A pop-up notification informed the boy that the villagers hated him. He replied that he had already noticed it. Lloyd walked without taking his hands out of his pockets, asked why Xavier was following him. Xavier kept his hand on the hilt of his sword and said that the Baron ordered him to guard him and make sure that Lloyd did not repeat yesterday. The hero asked again in surprise, did he really need to guard him? Xavier calmly replied that it would be more accurate to protect the residents from him, to which the hero called himself a monster, not suspecting inside what he had done before. Lloyd looked around guiltily, realizing that he first needed to clean up his image so that at least someone would give him a piece of bread when he started begging. He mentally stopped himself, deciding that it would be better to somehow sort out his family debt first. He imagined himself bathing in huge honeycombs, realizing that in this case, as the successor to the owner of the village, he would be able to live in luxury for the rest of his life. Lloyd mentally asked if there were any cheats here. A blue window immediately appeared in front of him and he was surprised that there were skills here. Lloyd's skills on the table were such skills as worthlessness and drunkard. Dissatisfied, Lloyd tried to knock this table down with his hands, but Xavier, who saw nothing, looked at his master with embarrassment. Lloyd, struggling with the table, went ahead. Xavier called out to him and asked where he was going. Lloyd only turned to the white-haired man in confusion. There was a tavern on the side of the guys. Xavier stopped at the level of the door, looking at the guilty gentleman and pointed to the tavern, asking if the apology was really a lie. Lloyd began to deny it. Xavier fell silent in confusion. Indignant Lloyd began to shower him with questions. Xavier closed his eyes and invited the gentleman to come in. Lloyd slowly opened the door, looked inside with an apology, to which Xavier, standing behind him, could not find words. He looked at the gentleman calmly, but internally he understood that something was wrong with him since yesterday, as if he had become a different person. In the tavern, all the furniture was broken. Cracks were crawling along the wall, the trophy skulls were half broken. Lloyd fell heavily onto a chair and loudly declared that he wanted to apologize for his pranks. Xavier watched in surprise. The bald owner of the tavern took a fighting stance, which was noted by the blue notification window. Lloyd looked at the owner of the tavern, bewildered, as he stuttered and asked the gentleman to stop. The hero thought that perhaps this happened because such a non-entity as he suddenly began to speak respectfully. Lloyd looked away, deciding to change his strategy, briefly and rudely asked for forgiveness. The notification plate noted the inappropriate behavior of the apologetic man. The hero still could not understand what it required of him. The bald man, covered in sweat, bowed and stuttered that everything was fine and that the hero did not need to apologize. Lloyd remained silent in surprise, but looked at the owner of the tavern. The sky was clear and bright. Xavier and Lloyd crossed a small bridge. The hero noted with difficulty that the innkeeper's face, even after the apology, was not very good. Xavier noted that this was not surprising. He looked at the guy and said that all the utensils and dishes that he had broken were bought with money earned with sweat and blood, and that perhaps only by receiving compensation would the innkeeper be satisfied. Lloyd was indignant, thinking that there were only debts at home and there could be no talk of compensation. he still could not admit that he could not look good in the eyes of the residents. The hero understood that if he did not sort out the debts, then nothing would work out, but he did not understand how to do this. Xavier continued the story, throwing the hero off track even more, saying that in addition to the pogrom, the health of the inn's mother left much to be desired. Lloyd looked away, remembering the only fireplace in the inn and how cold it was there. The boys walked on the bare ground, while Lloyd continued to think about how hard it would be for old people to survive in such cold weather until they invented a floor heating system. The hero stopped, while Xavier continued to walk. Lloyd stared into space in amazement. A light bulb went on in his head. He looked down thoughtfully, realizing that the light bulb in his head sparkled. He realized that something had come to his mind. His eyes opened wide. The light bulb in his head burst into a flash of electricity. The hero compared it to a sudden explosion and the idea that came after it. A green line rushed through space. There were many more of them, and together they formed something big, taking shape more and more with each passing second. Lloyd diligently imagined a floor heating system in his head. He thought that if he created a heating system in this world, it would definitely sell. The hero imagined his body turning over tables and realized that the fool Frontra had never even dreamed of it. He saw his true self above the body and told himself that this was possible for Kim Soo-ho. Kim Soo remembered many schemes in his head. He was a construction engineer, remembered how in the army he tried to build a house alone. He remembered how he carried piles of bricks on special carriers, remembered how he worked day and night on construction sites. Lloyd smiled and mentally realized that this was his plan, with which he would cover all the debts of the Baron's family. Encouraged, Lloyd turned around and told his frozen companion to return to the tavern. Lloyd turned and shouted that they were going to receive the first order. The notification announced the beginning of the hero's real journey. It said that the relationship point system was activated, said that the hero can gain reputation by interacting with others. At the moment, the amount of reputation was 0. Lloyd looked at the huge blue signs in front of his face in confusion. The hero frowned and thought what PR was it something like experience? A system window appeared, that by improving relations with the main characters, he could get PR. He turned his head and thought that something was appearing above Xavier's head. The system window said that his interest level in Lloyd was -30. He thought that this was probably a very low level. The guy smiled nervously and turned to his companion. He smiled and said that he was very handsome. Xavier raised his eyebrows and said that he knew. A system window appeared, that his interest level in the hero dropped to -31. Lloyd turned away and thought that he would leave it for later. If he continued, it would only get worse. After a while, the hero looked at the sheet in surprise and said that the customer was the innkeeper, the performer was Lloyd Frontera. He smiled and said that the construction costs are deducted from the amount of compensation for the damage caused. The innkeeper looked at him with a stony face. A system window appeared that he did not trust him. The skill mental wall emanated from him. The hero thought that this was their problem, not a drop of trust. The young man pursed his lips and thought that he could not ruin his grand plan from the very beginning, did not want to use this method. He decided to use the characteristic of insignificance. Lloyd grimaced and said that they would see each other often, so they should trust each other. The innkeeper began to write on the paper. The hero thought that this trash really works. He smiled and thought that the first contract was signed. Xavier looked at him with distrust, while Lloyd said that he made an excellent choice and would definitely not regret it. After a while, the guy held a shovel and thought that his plan was not that grand, so precise calculations were not required. He turned around when his companion called out to him. The blue-haired man frowned and said that he blackmailed the innkeeper into signing the contract. Was this really a new level of tyranny? Lloyd looked at him silently. He raised an eyebrow and asked if he really had no logic at all. Had he heard of cognitive distortion? The hero extended a finger and explained that the distortion occurs because every cell in the brain is stereotypes and negative thoughts, as if it was like this in the past, then it will be like this in the future. Xavier looked at him and said that it was not a stereotype, but experience and statistics. Lloyd looked at him and asked, after all, experience and statistics are all in the past, aren't they? The blue-haired man silently looked at him and thought what was going on. Had he really formulated his thoughts so correctly before? He shuddered when Lloyd said that they would smile. The guy stuck the shovel into the ground and said that both the innkeeper and his mother would laugh with joy. He stuck the shovel deeper. The hero threw away the earth and thought that their smiles would be the foundation of his earnings. He wielded the shovel and thought that he needed to dig, move, compact the earth and repeat. Lloyd hammered nails into the wood and thought that the lumber from the warehouse in the mansion would be an excellent basis for the central wooden frame. He lay down next to the building and thought that it was enough to apply river clay and the frame was ready. The guy was covered in sweat and thought how weak his body was. Xavier came closer and said that he did it quickly. The hero shouted, did it really take a whole week? The blue-haired looked at him in surprise and thought that he was really building something. Where did he learn how to do this? Did he really decide to honor the contract? For a rowdy like him it was impossible. Lloyd stood up and said that his bones were aching, but there was no time to rest. He took the axe, then he swung, but suddenly he began to fall. His hand was caught. Xavier didn't let him fall. He took the axe from him. The guy looked back and asked what he needed to do. Lloyd answered with surprise that he needed boards measuring 1 span horizontally and 2 spans vertically. The blue-haired man threw up some logs. He swung bloodthirstily, and with one blow he chopped them. The perfect boards fell to the ground. The hero's jaw almost dropped. He gave him a thumbs up. The guy looked at his subordinate's back and thought that he was definitely a sword master. He didn't even need modern tools. The brunette put his hand on the guy's shoulder and called him by name. He picked up the shovel and asked if he would help him with the digging when he finished. Xavier frowned and thought that not only did he not thank him, but he also made him work. How could he forget about his character? A system window appeared that Xavier regretted his decision. Lloyd leaned over to him and asked if he had helped out of curiosity, that he would definitely cheat someone, but in what way? He wanted to see the result, then what should be done, right? Finish what was started, and what should be done to finish it faster. The guy smiled and said that they needed to work together. Xavier looked at him irritably. He thought that the brunette was right, and for several days now he had been completely different, but he still could not trust him because of his past. The blue-haired man got to work and decided that he would be able to check it only after finishing the job. Xavier was digging with sweat on his brow. Lloyd was also working. He threw back the earth. The hero lifted the shovel triumphantly and stuck it into the ground. He raised his fist and shouted that the construction was complete. Lloyd looked defiantly at the sky. Xavier asked him what kind of hieroglyph it was. He replied that it was the logo of his brand. The hero looked back and asked if it was time for a check. He raised his head and continued, wasn't it time to see how he had fooled the innkeeper? Xavier looked at him silently. The wind was rustling. The fireplace was crackling. Smoke was coming out of the chimney of the house. The old woman was lying on the floor and saying how nice it was here. She was smiling and said that her joints were finally resting. The innkeeper raised his eyebrows and asked how this was possible. Lloyd smiled and thought that the people of this world could only be surprised. The old woman was smiling and thought that this power of heating the floors was almost like magic. The innkeeper looked at the hero and thanked him. He said that he had not seen his mother smile for a long time. Xavier opened his eyes in shock and thought that the innkeeper and his mother were laughing as he said. He looked at the hero and thought how this was possible. In one morning, not only his manner of speech and facial expression had changed, but he also worked hard and even fulfilled his promise. The blue-haired man thought, did he really want to see these people smile? It was impossible. He was not that kind of person. The innkeeper and his mother were smiling. Xavier smiled and thought that he saw how happy they were. A system window appeared that Xavier's interest level had increased by 2 points and was now at -29. Lloyd smiled. He looked around and said that he probably thought he wasn't such a piece of trash. He said no. The hero said he thought he was right. The guy smiled and thought that in any case the first order was completed, and even though he was in the red, it didn't matter. He thought it was because he had built this little house for advertising. A few days later, many people were standing in line. The man came out of the house and said he thought it would melt. Lloyd slapped the table and asked how he was. Wasn't it hot? Wouldn't he like a room like that in his house too? He handed over a sheet of paper and said that Model A was a separate building in the yard and Model B was a remodel of the house. If he signed both orders, he would get a 10% discount. The man shrank back and began to refuse. A system window appeared that the villager did not trust Lloyd. He said that they would see each other often, which meant they should trust each other. He leaned over and asked if he really didn't believe him. For such a price, it was just a gift. The guy looked away when someone called out to him. His father looked at him and asked what he was doing here. A system window appeared that his interest level was -20. Lloyd frowned. Front of a mansion. The hero was sitting at a long dining table opposite his father. The guy glanced at him furtively and thought that he had been carefully avoiding him, afraid that the head of the family would forbid construction. The man calmly cut the sausage. The young man frowned when his father said that he was ready to listen to him. Arcus frowned and asked what he had come up with this time. The guy brought a fork with food and replied that the innkeeper had ordered floor heating, and he had fulfilled it. He decided to avoid long explanations and act according to his character. The interlocutor looked at him and added that his son was now making contracts with other residents. The hero nodded. The man frowned and said that the residents were very important and valuable, and he would not forgive the boy if he deceived them. Lloyd closed his eyes and replied that he didn't have to worry about that. As the boy had expected, no matter what he did, no one believed him. The boy got up from the table and said that he was leaving since his father had nothing more to say. The hero tried to run away as quickly as possible. Arcus closed his eyes and assumed that his son was doing this because of the situation in their family. He frowned and assured him that he could quickly deal with such a trifle himself, so the boy didn't have to interfere. Lloyd turned around and looked at him sadly. He had heard these words before. His father had assured him the same thing in his past life, convincing him that the main thing was to study and not worry. The hero really thought that everything was fine. The brown-haired man pressed his lips together and thought that it was a lie, that nothing was right. He didn't want to become pathetic because of someone's lousy money. He moved towards the exit and asked his father not to give up, because the boy would try too. A few years ago, when the hero had to say these words to his father, the boy was walking down the corridor and calculating that he had received 32 orders for Model and 57 orders for Model B. The hero had already received almost half of the deposit. He stopped when he saw two men in front of him. They were the loan sharks Shalo and Meatloaf. They passed by, and the young man was surprised that these two even greeted the Baron's son. The hero frowned, and an idea struck him. The guests entered Arcus's office. One of them sat down leisurely on the edge of the table and asked how long the man would delay payment. The fat man added that more than 5 days had already passed, and if he continued to delay payments like this, they would not sit idly by. The Baron frowned and looked down. Shalo looked at him with disdain and said that if he sold the items in the house, the money would appear. The protagonist cautiously peered through the door. He smirked and mentally noted that it was timely. The guy grinned and thought that they appeared when needed. RP amount, 36. The young man looked at the system window and noted that he received some points by improving his relationship with Xavier. It remained to figure out where to use them. Notification: by investing the received points in talent, you can improve your abilities. The guy looked at the screen in surprise and noted that the messenger still knows how to explain normally. Next message: damn, I will not explain. The hero hastened to apologize. Suddenly, a circle lit up under Lloyd's feet. It began to rise higher up the young man's body. Knowledge: soil mechanics, hydrology, structural mechanics, water supply system, design of steel and concrete structures, the highest level of design. The system wrote that the hero, surprisingly, knows a lot. The brown-haired man frowned and shouted that he definitely needed to get a word in. Notification: possible improvement of knowledge-based skills. Topographic survey, base, required number of points 15. Design, base, required number of points 15. The guy crossed his arms and thought that it was not entirely clear what and how, but there was enough RP and he could try. He clicked on both options. Skill name: topographic survey, base. His eyes suddenly began to glow, and the hero leaned out the window with a scream. The young man saw a virtual grid for design in front of him. Lloyd was surprised that even without using GPS he could calculate everything, just seeing everything with his own eyes. Skill name: design, base. The brown-haired man began to draw a diagram of the house right in the air in front of him. Just recently he had suffered, drawing a project on a piece of paper. The hero sat down on the bed and thought that in the future, of course, it would be much easier for him, but would Xavier's help alone be enough? The guy raised an eyebrow and dreamed that it would be nice to summon heavy equipment. The system reported that there was something to summon. The young man looked at the screen in shock. Random phantom selection. Using RP, you can summon a phantom. Different capabilities, different skills. Choose a phantom partner who will try his best for you in everything. The hero noted that this looked like an advertisement for the game. He squinted and saw on the screen that one phantom choice 50 RP. Lloyd frowned and realized that he was not enough, only 1 point remained. The brown-haired man thoughtfully touched his chin and imagined that the phantom could be a mythical animal like a dragon or a unicorn. In this case, their strength would be equal to the strength of heavy equipment. The guy frowned and decided that he needed to collect RP, and to do this he needed to get the interest of the main characters. Meatloaf slammed his hand on the table and, looking at the Baron, said that he could suggest one way if he didn't have a penny. He grinned and said that a man could sell his wife and children and get good money. Arcus looked at his interlocutor in shock and asked again. The hero said that he should maintain the boundaries of decency, even if he was a creditor. The guy put his hand on the fat guest's shoulder. The man recoiled and asked who he was. The father looked at the young man in confusion and said his name. Meatloaf narrowed his eyes and muttered that he was that special naughty eldest son who butted into adults' conversations. He wanted to threaten the guy to leave, but he interrupted him. The hero extended his hand and demanded to see the invitation letter first. The Moneylenders shuddered in surprise. Lloyd bowed his head and said that the fundamental law of the kingdom, Chapter 3, Article 6, states that all aristocracy are subjects of the king and have the right to protect their interests. He looked menacingly at the guests and declared that entering the residence of the aristocracy without an invitation letter is considered an intrusion, and this is contained in the law. The interlocutors got angry and shouted that this was nonsense. The young man raised an eyebrow and suggested that they all check together for the presence of the law. The guy frowned and called Xavier. The knight entered the room and greeted the gentleman. The hero bared his teeth and ordered that the intruder's hand be cut off. The swordsman silently grabbed the handle of the weapon. The guests backed away in fear and shouted that they had completely lost their minds. The brown-haired man raised his chin and suggested that they check again whose side the court would take. Xavier threateningly bared his blade. The Moneylenders began to sweat and looked at him in fear. The men quickly headed for the exit, shouting that they would make him regret it. The door quickly slammed behind them. Lloyd chuckled and called them worthless. The Baron turned to the boys, and they looked at him. The man jumped up and asked what they had just done in a situation where they had to beg on their knees. The boy silently put the bag on the table. The boy smiled and said that he had originally wanted to get the entire deposit and give it back, but this amount was also enough to pay this month's interest. The father looked at him in shock and asked if this was really the money collected from the villagers. The knight closed his eyes and asked the Baron not to worry. He looked at the owner and promised that he would make sure that the boy fulfilled the terms of the contract. Arcus looked closely at the swordsman and thought that his expression showed that he completely trusted him. Lloyd bowed and said that in that case they would go. The boys walked down the corridor. Xavier glanced sideways at the master and said that he did not expect the fool to know such laws. The interlocutor frowned and exclaimed that he had simply heard it somewhere. In general, it was true. Xavier himself told about it in the novel. After the Baron and his wife committed suicide, 2 moneylenders wanted to dig up the bodies and sell them. Then the knight voiced this law. Saying these words, he cut their necks. In court, the guy was completely acquitted. The hero closed his eyes with satisfaction and thought that it was a big plus to know the contents of the novel. The young man smiled and noted that a notification should have arrived by now. Notification: Baron Frontera's interest has increased by 6 points. By improving relations with the main character, you receive 60 RP, quantity 61. Lloyd smiled that everything happened as he planned to get the Phantom as soon as possible. The moon was shining in the night sky. The hero was standing on the training ground. He looked around to make sure there was no one around. The guy looked at the system window and applied a random drawing of fantastic creatures. The young man pressed the button and looked at the glow in front of him. Gears were spinning in the air. Lloyd looked up in shock at the sight of such magic. A magic circle was hanging in front of him. The brown-haired man turned pale and thought that this spell was very weak and small. It just made an annoying noise. Something lit up from the magic circle, after which a mouse's head appeared. The aristocrat stared at it in shock. The animal jumped to the ground and looked at the guy. He silently looked at the mouse and grimaced in disappointment. The creature looked at its new owner in fear, after which it began to squeak loudly. The hero turned to him and asked if he could do a lot of things. Shooting acorns was not what he needed. The mouse waved its paws, refuting what the master had said. The guy asked to show him what it could do. The little animal began to chew something vigorously, after which it spat out 2 pieces of paper. The hero unfolded them with disgust and read the contents. It turned out that the creature Peepodong was a cute hamster, which the system asked to take care of with love. He shook out sunflower seeds into his palm. It was said that they could change the structure of the animal. Red sunflower seed: Peepodong will become huge, the effect will disappear in 12 hours. Blue sunflower seed: Peepodong will become small, feed this seed to the hamster before the effect of the red seed ends. The young man looked at the paper and read that a set of 2 seeds costs 1 RP. He looked at the hamster and asked if it grows to the size of a human. Peepodong squeaked in response, and the hero realized that he needed to check for himself. The boy gave the hamster a seed and thought that the animal should be good at digging and could be useful if it became the size of a human. Peepodong began to chew the seed. The aristocrat looked in surprise as it began to glow and increase in size. Something pushed the hero, and he flew back. Lloyd stared at him in shock and turned pale. A 5-meter hamster stood in front of him. No, it was at least 10 meters. Peepodong looked at his owner with disdain. Peepodong skill: digging level 1. The animal began to dig actively, leaving a ditch behind it. Peepodong skill: strengthening the earth level 1. The hamster rolled over on its back and began to compact the soil. Peepodong skill: puffing out its cheeks level 1. The animal puffed out its cheeks and spat out a boulder. The stone plopped down in front of the hero. The young man smiled and was glad that the problem with the heavy equipment was solved. Lloyd walked down the corridor, his hands in his pockets. He wondered if people would be suspicious if the guy suddenly showed up with this magical creature. The hero grinned and decided that he would carry a summoning book with him and tell everyone that he was a genius summoner. The nobleman looked ahead and remembered that it was time to solve the problem with workers for a large-scale construction project. The next day, the young man stood in front of a group of people with shovels and ordered them to repeat after him. He squeezed the handle of the tool and shouted that safety was above all. The 30-man Frontera barony army looked at the gentleman absent-mindedly and sluggishly repeated the phrase. The brown-haired man smiled tensely and thought that these guys looked like soldiers who were paid but did not work. He was surprised that they had not been dispersed yet, considering that the Baron had a lot of debt. The boy smiled and pointed out that that was why they wouldn't get any overtime bonuses. It was good that they had manpower. Lloyd frowned and shouted that they were soldiers, and when they got together, they were an army. The hero threw his shovel over his shoulder and said that their essence was to complete tasks. The young man remembered that when he was in the army, they did more digging and weeding than training. The nobleman pointed to a pile of earth and said that he dug it up after working all night. In fact, Peepodong dug it all up in half an hour. The brown-haired man put his hand on his belt and shouted that the first task was to revive the estate. This was a boiler room project for the people of the estate. To make it, the soldiers had to move the earth to the construction site. The man looked at the master with disappointment. The hero had expected them to react like that. Someone came up behind him and called out. The senior knight of the Newman barony looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he had ordered his men to do. Lloyd smirked and thought that he had expected the man to speak up. There were 3 knights in this estate: Newman, his subordinate Bayern, and the protagonist of the novel, Xavier Asrahan. At the beginning of the novel, only Bayern and Xavier remained loyal until the fall of the estate. The senior knight looked at the boy with displeasure. It was this man who had been the first to betray and abandon the Baron. Since it was Newman who had sold information about the Baron to swindlers, he owed a hefty debt. The hero looked at the swordsman with disdain and wondered how such a man could even be the senior knight. The young man looked at his interlocutor with a grin and asked him what he thought they were doing. The man frowned and said that he could not believe that an aristocrat was forcing the militia to do dirty work. He added that, as the head of the knights, he could not tolerate this. The guy leaned on the shovel and thought it was nonsense, because the hero was earning money to pay off his debts. He said that he had obtained the Baron's permission. The knight stood opposite the aristocrat. Newman said that he did not know how the young man had outwitted his lord, but offered to recall the young master's past. The man frowned and suggested that his interlocutor was using the militia forces for personal gain. The brown-haired man closed his eyes, then smiled and replied that he was right. The hero glared menacingly at the swordsman and warned that he would get it now. The warrior's face instantly distorted with anger and irritation. Just think about his weak self-control. If the knight had tried to play an online game, he would have exploded in a minute. Lloyd pulled the tool out of the ground and, swinging, threw sand at his interlocutor. The soldiers stared at them in shock. The man covered his eyes with his hand in displeasure, and the brown-haired man only grinned. The swordsman was shaking with anger. He looked at the young man angrily and was indignant that he had really tried to tarnish the knight's reputation. In his mind, Newman called him the stupid son of a nearly bankrupt baron. The hero put his hand to his ear and asked if his interlocutor really wanted to throw away his regalia and fight. The guy swung his shovel and pointed it at the warrior. Lloyd smiled and suggested a duel. The flushed man raised his eyebrows and warned that the young man would regret it. Frontera Estate. The hero was going to duel Newman in a month. Xavier looked at the gentleman and asked if he was so sure of his victory. The aristocrat was sitting on the bed, crossing his legs. He looked at the knight and exclaimed that he was not. The boy added that his opponent was a knight called the Heart of Mana and a junior sword expert, and he himself was just a lazybones. Naturally, he was not up to fighting him. The young man asked if the other man had even thought about it before asking such a question. Xavier frowned in irritation and squeezed the hilt of his sword. Then the warrior loosened his grip and noted that he had almost cut down the gentleman. He looked at the hero picking his nose and could not believe that he had suddenly thrown dirt at the Newman knight and even asked for a duel. Perhaps the young man wanted to be a scoundrel again. However, the boy himself asked the Baron for a favor, then entered into an argument and pushed Xavier away. By this time, he had appointed Knight Bayern as a temporary manager and was in charge of the construction team. However, the young man was unsure about this duel. The brown-haired man pulled a booger out of his nose, and the other man immediately wanted to hack him to death. The hero wiped his hands and said that the knight had to do something. The young man smiled and asked to be taught how to handle a sword. The other man frowned and said that he did not want to. The aristocrat looked at him with disappointment and asked why. The swordsman replied that, first of all, it was his duty to protect the young master. The blonde man looked calmly at Lloyd and added that he was like a sack, and if a sack learned fencing, it would be even more dangerous to be around him. The aristocrat asked to at least speak more softly. The brown-haired man once again clarified whether the knight really did not want to teach him. The hero smiled confidently and said that he would deal with his insomnia in exchange. Xavier looked at the gentleman in shock, not understanding how he knew about it. The young man grinned and thought that, thanks to the novel, he also knew the reason for his insomnia. In the work The Knight of Iron and Blood, knights are divided into 4 levels by rank: Sword Master, Supreme Sword Expert, Middle Sword Expert, Junior Sword Expert. Xavier's level is Supreme Sword Expert, and he will soon become a Master Sword Master. The reason for his insomnia is his inhuman nerves, which are too sensitive. This is the so-called Sword Master Syndrome. The brown-haired man leaned on his hands and thought that in the countryside they do not know such things, so the knight himself does not know either. The hero looked at his interlocutor and asked if he agreed to the deal, because it was written on his face that he had insomnia. Xavier sighed and replied that he would try. The nobleman smiled and asked him not to give in to him. The swordsman chuckled and said that he was saying this because the young man would definitely fail. He had tried many things to cure his insomnia, starting with cognitive behavioral therapy, herbal remedies, aromatherapy, exercise, oriental medicine, and the like. The knight was sleeping peacefully in a chair, hugging a pillow. The protagonist stood in front of him and chuckled that he knew exactly how to cure insomnia. The 18th magic technique is reading a manual on reinforced concrete structures. This is what puts you to sleep. The guy grinned and thought that all the swordsman's skills would now be his. The sun was shining in the sky. The refreshed and well-rested knight looked at the master and ordered him to run 50 laps. The hero looked at the warrior in surprise and turned around and ran. The swordsman turned to look at the master and was amazed that he ran without complaint. Lloyd was running circles around the training ground. He ran up to the knight and muttered in a tired voice that he hated it and was eager to learn something. After these words, the guy ran on. Having completed the next circle, the hero smiled at his interlocutor and asked if he expected that the aristocrat would not be able to and would whine. The warrior continued to watch the gentleman running circles. At the next turn, the sweaty guy exclaimed that the knight would have simply said that the young man was not cut out for it and waved him off. Xavier shuddered, because the interlocutor guessed right. The brown-haired man ran on with a laugh, shouting that he would run to the end. Notification: passive skill ugliness increased to level 4. Anyone who sees you will take you for a freak and will feel the desire to punch you. The young man got angry and exclaimed that he did not have such a skill. The hero was sweating and breathing heavily. It would be a lie to say that he was not tired. However, this was nothing compared to his life in Korea. He had no family to give him warmth. Every morning the boy opened his eyes in a crowded Gishiwan. Every day he carried bricks to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night the boy loaded trucks with boxes just to not die of hunger, always dreaming that someday it would get better. The young man encouraged himself that he was doing well, was qualified, and there was still a little bit left. But the light he was reaching for suddenly went out, and the hero was left alone with the darkness. Compared to that pain and despair, this was nothing. Lloyd ran under the moonlight and smiled. The knight continued to stand nearby. He looked closely at the master and thought that he would teach him his fencing technique if the aristocrat was so sincere. The brown-haired man continued to turn circles. Notification: Xavier's opinion of you has increased by +1. His opinion of you is -28. You have received 18 RP for slightly improving your relationship with a key character. Score: 29 RP. The manor was illuminated by the moon. The Baron sat at the table and looked at Newman standing in front of him. The man could not believe that his son would be so rude to the one who had protected their family for 5 generations. Arcus leaned on his hands and muttered that he thought the boy had come to his senses, but he must have misunderstood him. He looked at the swordsman and said that it was his moral duty not to interfere with the duel. Still, the Baron asked him not to be too cruel to the heir to the estate. The Lord looked at his interlocutor intently and ordered that the boy be brought to his senses, but not crippled. Newman bowed and accepted the request. The knight smirked and thought that he did not know if he could do it during the duel. He walked down the corridor, determined to kill this arrogant bastard. And if the Baron made a big deal out of it, he would destroy him and the Baroness too and pass it off as suicide. The swordsman smiled and thought that, as planned, he would then leave this village for a better place. Thanks to the young master, his plan was coming to fruition faster than he expected. A month passed. Spectators gathered around the training ground to watch the nobleman and the knight standing opposite each other. The protagonist's parents were sitting under the canopy, looking nervous, while Xavier and Baron stood behind them. The man raised his sword and asked if his opponent was ready. The boy took a step forward and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, answered in the affirmative. He smiled confidently and advised his opponent to get ready to rake in the dirt. While the young man stood there grinning, the people around him were discussing the fact that the gentleman would be fighting Newman with a shovel. The blonde gritted his teeth in anger. Xavier looked down at the hero and noticed that the metal shovel had been ordered from a blacksmith. Arcus covered his face with his hand and muttered that his son was an idiot who thought this was some kind of joke. The knight looked at the sight carefully and thought that if he remembered what the young man had been doing for the past month, it might not be a joke. The gentleman did general exercises early in the morning without complaining, then went to the construction site to explain the boiler room to the village engineers, and after that, trained with a sword until he wanted to sleep. This did not look like a man who was just joking. Xavier frowned, sure that the young gentleman was serious. The Baron raised his hand and announced that the duel between Lloyd Frontera and the knight Newman was about to begin. The man took a fighting stance, and the boy grabbed the shovel with a grin. Xavier frowned, not understanding what kind of stupid stance this was. The blonde attacked first, outraged by his opponent's behavior. The brown-haired man swung the shovel and easily blocked his opponent's blow. The father and the swordsman standing behind him stared at the duelists in surprise. Newman swung again and thought that the young man would not be lucky a second time. However, this attack was also blocked by the young gentleman. Xavier's eyes widened and he realized that this incredible and effective technique was used in real battles, as if his swordsmanship had suddenly improved after so many years. The opponent began to sweat and looked warily at Lloyd. The young man grinned and thought that there was nothing surprising in this, because in Korea every man could do this. This is a modern hand-to-hand combat technique, a bayonet attack. He lunged with the shovel, and the opponent recoiled in fear. The hero covered himself with the tool, using it as a shield. Then he made another lunge with the tip, but the man dodged. The young man thrust the weapon into the ground and, laughing, began to jump on it. Xavier sweated and wondered if the aristocrat was really joking. The sweaty guy continued to laugh, but his gaze remained confident. The watching knight tried to understand his plan. Newman ran up to attack with a cry. The brown-haired man took a fighting stance and thought that the first thing he had prepared for the enemy was a shovel, and the second was the basic fencing that Xavier had taught him. The young man fought off the attacks and gradually pushed the enemy back. The man clenched his teeth in irritation, not understanding when the drunkard and scum had become so strong. The third thing the hero had prepared was this, a synchronized skill for handling a tool. Digging, level 1. Become one with the shovel, body and soul. The level of synchronization between you and your shovel will increase. The guy swung, and his tool began to glow. Xavier's opinion of the hero increased by +1 during the training. And the Baron and Baroness, who saw their son's sincerity for the first time in their lives, had it increased by +2 and +3. They accumulated 97 RP, which allowed them to purchase an additional skill for 40 points. Then the hero realized that he had learned a pretty cool skill. He looked closely at his opponent. The man exhaled and swung his sword. Newman thought that he had no choice. It was unlikely that this should be used against an ordinary person, but he wanted to. A glow began to emanate from his body. Xavier narrowed his eyes. The enemy was pumping up mana. The brown-haired man frowned, realizing this. The enemy was about to use a mana heart. The mustachioed man grabbed the handle and, frowning, declared that now everything was serious. The young man did not answer, and the opponent rushed at him. The knight watching them frowned and thought that someone who had not had any talents for 10 years, even the most ordinary ones, would need at least 5 years to master the mana heart. The young master would not be able to block such an attack. The man swung his blade. The boy held the shovel in front of him, but the enemy only grinned, confident that he would cut it in half and break the aristocrat's skull. The protagonist's parents jerked in horror, and the woman covered her mouth with her hands. The blow hit the shovel, but it did not flinch. Newman stared ahead in shock. He felt like all his strength was leaking out. Lloyd smirked and thought that this was the fourth skill he had prepared, Mana Mastery, which made Xavier the strongest man in the novel. The knight watched the duel closely. Mana flowed into the boy's body through the weapon. This was the technique of the Asrahan core. The man recoiled in fear and exclaimed that his mana had been drained. At that moment, the hero swung and hit his opponent in the face with a shovel. A broken tooth flew against the blue sky, which its owner looked at sadly. Lloyd's next blow was to the chin with the opposite end of the tool. The boy looked down at the swordsman with an ominous look and hit him hard on the head. Newman fell flat on the ground at his feet. All the spectators widened their eyes in shock. They saw the knight lying in front of the boy, but they could not believe that the young master had won. Arcus raised his hand in confusion and announced that Lloyd Frontera had won the duel. The blonde was lying on the ground and did not understand how such a master of the sword could lose to the scum. The aristocrat came closer and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, said that the man had been beaten. The hero swung and said that it was time for the long-awaited punishment. The man looked up in fear. The Baron jumped up and shouted that the duel was already over. The young man began to beat the enemy with a shovel. Arcus frowned and shouted his son's name in rage. The knights immediately began to hold the protagonist so that he would stop hitting Newman with a shovel. Bayern stood next to Xavier at this time and looked at what was happening with an angry expression, suggesting that the protagonist had gone crazy. At this time, Xavier looked ahead with sadness and realized that Lloyd could have lost his mind. The protagonist at this time waved his hands and sighed heavily, because he ordered to let him go because he had calmed down. Then he put the shovel on the ground and his hands on his belt, sighing with relief. Then he started hitting his opponent with the shovel again and they tried to restrain him again. Xavier looked through his bangs with displeasure and realized, if you look closely, he was hitting him so as not to hurt him too much. At this time, the blonde with a mustache screamed from the blows. The brown-haired man at this time looked at his opponent angrily, but Xavier saw this calm expression on his face because he seemed to know in advance what would happen next and as if he already knew everything. At this time, the guy with blue hair looked ahead coldly. In his memories, 15 days before the duel, the brown-haired man leaned his hand on the blade and wanted to learn the Azarakan technique of the mind. At that moment, Xavier looked at him in surprise, and the brown-haired man did not understand such a reaction because he asked to teach him something good and not stealing. It was a silhouette of a man who absorbed the aura streams, because in addition to the assimilated mana, it can attract mana from what surrounds him and transform it into his mana. At that moment, the knight looked at him intently and asked the master how he knew this, because he understood that he had always kept this technique a secret because it was still not complete. Lloyd looked at his teacher with wide eyes and said that he helped him fall asleep, and Xavier talked about it in his sleep. At this time, the main character with a malicious grin and a masked face looked at the teacher, who understood that it was only his imagination that now imagined him with an iron mask on his face. The blue-haired guy looked intently at the brown-haired man, who threw his sword behind his head, and to his regret, said that he could not teach him this technique because it was still not complete. The main character raised his eyebrows with irony, asking if he could complete it, would he be trained? Xavier looked at him with disdain and said if he said so, then perhaps it would be so, but he was embarrassed by this self-confident look. Then Lloyd stuck his sword into the ground. He looked at his hands and tried to insert a finger into his fist, assuming that his mana heart was absorbing mana from outside by itself. Then he was about to hit his fist on his palm and assumed that it bounced off as a result, and as he saw, from the point of view of his heart, external mana is something foreign. Then it was a silhouette of a man with outstretched arms, who absorbed streams of aura, because he wanted to change the source. The which he absorbs from outside will not mix with the mana heart. It was a glowing core with pulses of light, because he ordered to let it gather separately. This ball of light began to sparkle and emit streams, because it needed to be rolled up and used. The brown-haired man began to rotate his finger near his fist with a grin and explained that it was like an auxiliary engine near the main engine, because they were one whole, but at the same time worked separately, and it should be great. Xavier looked at him with displeasure and explained that he was sure that it was possible, but did not understand where Lloyd came from before such reasoning. Then the main character stretched out his hands in front of his face, on which there was an iron mask, because he said that he simply imagined. Xavier saw this expression and assumed that he clearly knew something, but just did not show it. The protagonist looked at how his teacher stretched his hands to the sides and began to emit streams of light and aura, because he managed to complete the Astrakhan technique of the mind, which had been bothering him for a long time. It was a blue core that emitted pulses of light around itself, because over the time of his first attempt, the number of contours that he could create increased to 3, and if he trained more, he could reach 4 or even 5 contours. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of Lloyd had increased by +5. The protagonist opened his mouth and bulged his eyes in amazement. He was surprised how much he had been taught the mana heart technique, because he didn't need it, because he only wanted to learn part of the absorption, and he didn't need the mana around him, but only the one he touched. Young Mr. Lloyd had such an ability, so Xavier expected that he would defeat the Knight Newman. At that time, the guys were trying to restrain the protagonist, who was bloodthirstily trying to finish off the lying fighter, and triumphantly. At that time, the protagonist's father was furious, hitting the table with his hands, because he did not want to allow him to ruin the knight's reputation any longer. Arcus watched his enraged son being restrained. At this time, the brown-haired man was sweating and trying to catch his breath when he heard about the knight's reputation. Then he pointed a finger at his father in displeasure and told him to look under the tablecloth before he decided whether these words were appropriate for Nikita's knight. A pile of sealed letters lay on the table under a white coverlet. Arcus looked at these letters in horror. While Newman lay writhing in pain, the brown-haired man looked at his father and said that towards who was causing harm to the Baron's estate, and a letter from this scoundrel Knight Newman. Arcus convulsively opened his mouth, holding the letter, because Lloyd explained that it was the furnishings of the estate. What the Baron liked and did not like, and instructions on how to forge property documents, and in these letters everything that they managed to share. The protagonist looked at the agitated Newman with a cold face, not understanding how he found the letters he hid inside the walls. At this time, the protagonist smiled maliciously and said that in the novel, Xavier found them later. He remembered how his little beast Peapodon went to get the letters last night. The father sat down on the chair in horror, looking at the table with the letters. Then he looked at his son, who was staring at him, and realized, as expected, that in the novel he was described as a kind person, because it would be a big fuss if he were to kill him now. Then he closed his lips with a dissatisfied grin and realized that the words kind ruler and good ruler meant completely different things. The protagonist looked at all the nobles at the table and realized that if his father was so worried about how to get rid of this man, then he could offer him something. At this time, the brown-haired man was holding his shovel, while Newman was on the ground, looking at him with excitement. Newman heard that they wanted to put an angry rat on his head and then expel him from the estate, wounded by rats, and if not, then they would demote him to an ordinary soldier and give him a chance to atone for his sins. At this time, the rest of the people were frightened by such a statement, because they understood that it sounded inhuman. Arcus at this time, his eyes bulged in surprise and understood that in order to carry out justice for a minor offense, he would be given a chance to atone, but with a warning of a more severe punishment. Bayern stood next to Xavier and frowned, saying that it was a wise and generous decision and a good warning to others. The protagonist looked at the nobles who sat on the platform, and they agreed to do as he suggested. At this time, the knight with a mustache, without raising his head, said that he had no objections, because he had just been shown mercy. The protagonist looked at him puzzled and tried to understand what kind of mercy. He imagined how a black silhouette of a man sat on a rug in front of his king, and Lloyd understood if he would treat the criminals kindly and whether they would atone for their sins for the forgiveness granted to them. But he realized that this would not happen. Then his black silhouette laughed maliciously, because he realized that in this case they would become more decisive and strong-willed and would try to take advantage of their kindness. At this time Newman grinned angrily and realized that they would regret this decision because he would definitely take revenge on this upstart. Newman looked discontentedly from under his brows at the protagonist, who was glad of his smile, and it was a pity that it would be his last. The beaten knight looked at his opponent in bewilderment and asked him to repeat. Then the main character gave a seed to his hamster. Then he threw this beast high into the sun. Lloyd looked at Newman with bloodthirsty arrogance and declared what the best way to ask for forgiveness was, hinting that there was none. At this time, the hamster was deliciously devouring the seed. Then he began to increase in size. The blonde, along with Arcus, looked at what was happening in amazement. Bayern, along with Andri, were also scared and opened their mouths in horror. The rest of the crowd of people bulged their eyes in shock from the black shadow. It was the same hamster that had grown in size. Newman's eyes widened in horror, his mouth opened because the hamster was about to fall on him. This huge pet was flying from the sky with its entire body towards Newman. At that time, the protagonist stood with his back to Newman, his hand on his belt, and there was a bang. The huge hamster was lying on the ground, having crushed the knight. The brown-haired man raised his finger up with a malicious smile and understood that such people should be driven out because this would solve the problem with the rotten man inside the estate forever. It was a huge mountain plain with fields. At that time, Peepodong was throwing the earth. This hamster was throwing it in all directions. Peepodong was digging a ditch along the entire street of the city. The brown-haired man looked at him with a grin, while Xavier tried to understand what his beast was doing. Lloyd replied that he was getting ready to widen the road. They were tired and excited workers who were carrying materials and bags. Then moments later they immediately became pumped up and angry with sweat because they suddenly turned into brave craftsmen. It was a beautiful white tile laid in a path. Lloyd explained that in ancient times there was such a city as Rome and its inhabitants loved roads very much because they built a special road system called the Appice Way. The main character looked at the teacher with a grin from under his bangs and said that they would now start from the Baron's house and extend the road to the eastern slope. The protagonist was about to leave, putting his hand in his pockets, while Xavier looked cold-blooded and tried to understand why exactly the road, to which Lloyd replied that he himself would soon see everything. Xavier stared at the grin of his comrade, who said because the popularity of their village would skyrocket. Then the main character looked back with an exclamation when he was asked about where he learned all this. The main character looked at him intently, because Xavier asked about how he came up with the idea of a heating system that they had never heard of before. And he also suddenly learned to summon something from the Vey, and all this looks like high-level magic. The blue-haired knight looked at him with disdain and asked if he was really their master. A red message popped up about the danger that Xavier doubted him. The smooth character looked at him, bulging his eyes. Xavier looked cold-blooded and calm. The brown-haired man threw the shovel over his shoulder and thought with a sullen grin about when he read about this man in the novel. He already knew that he was a capable person and would be able to easily guess if a stranger entered the body of the Baron's son. The embittered knight was immediately going to pull out his blade, because this guy is not to be trifled with, but there is no reason to worry because he has a special skill for such cases. Lloyd twisted his face in horror, his eyes wide, because he studied in secret from everyone and assumed that he could do it. A notification with a special skill of persistence popped up. Lloyd anxiously squeezed his body, approached the teacher, who told him that the young gentleman drank all day long. Lloyd realized that he was being watched every hour of the day, and maybe he used to be a real scoundrel, but he did not know anything about what he was doing all this time. Xavier indifferently looked away and asked how he could explain the skills of a spellcaster, because even a mage with a lot of experience sometimes cannot do this. Xavier stared at the brown-haired man next to him, who was excited, trying to justify himself, and asked him the answer to the question, how did he cope with mana himself, although he was barely over 20, because no one taught him either and he should be a genius, but Xavier did not consider himself one. Lloyd opened his mouth in horror even more, because he asked there, could he be a genius, why the teacher did not consider himself as such, because he assumed that he suddenly became a genius spellcaster. Xavier looked at him intently with sweat on his brow and did not trust. The knight watched as Lloyd immediately turned around with displeasure and began to leave, adding in pursuit that if he had nothing more to say, then he would go, because he still had things to do. Notification that there were with a special skill of fast conversation and persistence. The brown-haired man continued to walk forward and tried to calm down, because he realized that Xavier began to suspect him. Then on the way he met Bayern, while the workers were sorting out the bags, and asked him to monitor the progress of the work while he was gone. The knight in the coat replied that everything would be done and there was nothing to worry about. Then the brown-haired man looked back in surprise at the blue-haired knight, who wanted to go with him because it was his duty to protect the young gentleman. Lloyd said with irony that such obvious things should not be said at all, because he would definitely go with him, and the knight asked about the way. Xavier began to follow the gentleman, who threw the shovel over his shoulder and looked happy because he answered that they were going to one place in the footsteps of an unpaid debt. The setting sunset behind the mountain enveloped a small remote town in the Rodinia estate. There was a sign with the inn's name. At this time, the man angrily hit the table with his fist and was indignant. They were transported to the house of the swindler Thords, who looked agitated and embittered because he had lost all his money and wanted to make all the scoundrels pay. At this time, a large guy in a black coat towered over him and asked if this was not the essence of gambling, since he himself earned money in this way. The brunette with a scar looked at the swindler with displeasure and said that since he had such a body, then if he was not able to pay for his services, then he would leave him immediately. Thords looked at the assistant with horror and said that he could pay and would even give him more, so he ordered him to stay near him. His comrade in a black suit said that he would go immediately if he did not receive payment on time. The swindler indignantly grabbed his head and said that he could only earn money by deceiving others, but now too many people would want to settle scores with him, so it was worth lying low for a while. Suddenly, the main character burst into their house with a kick and realized that they were talking about him. Lloyd entered this room, as the swindler immediately jumped up from such impudence. Lloyd looked at him with an echidna mulka and realized that he had not seen him. The main character looked at him maliciously through his bangs and introduced himself by his name. Thords with great horror bulged his eyes and opened his mouth. Thords immediately put his hand on his assistant in black, who offered his help, but the swindler wanted to leave here faster. His assistant immediately bent over the ground, grabbing his master. Then they quickly jumped out of the house through the window. This man in a black suit was about to land on the ground. The man with a scar on his face became angry with discontent. Xavier at this time cut his blade near the shoulder. The knight immediately swung his sword in the air. The knight in blue walked down the street with his sword, ordered to give him the swindler and leave himself, and then they will not touch him. Xavier looked at him through his bangs and realized that he had done everything as the young gentleman had said. The big guy in the black suit looked at the man who had blocked his way with displeasure, who knew that they would try to escape through the window, which was why he had waited here. The guy in the suit frowned with displeasure. Then the guy immediately bloodthirstily stretched out his hand with the black magic core and joked about whether the knight even knew how to handle his blade. At this time, the brown-haired man looked through the broken window in surprise and realized that after the death of the Baron, Xavier had longed for together because he had fought with the personal guard of Thords, the swindler whose trail he had managed to attack. Xavier watched as the black mage emitted streams of dark energy because this was his first battle with a dark mage. The knight immediately sat down on the ground, baring his teeth from such pressure and holding onto his sword because it was not easy for him and he had to resist the magic of gravity. Lloyd smiled maliciously because everything was just like in the novel. The dark mage sent a stream of black core towards the knight. Xavier managed to put out his blade to reflect the attack. This black aura tried to surround him from all sides. He immediately found himself in a purple core with dark matter. The dark mage with a grin frowned, stretching out his palm, because he understood that it was predetermined and Xavier must die. A huge fist immediately flew at him. The knight pressed himself to the ground with his feet and tried to convulsively hold the blade. The dark magician looked at what was happening with bewilderment and a sullen grin, because in the novel Xavier fought the scoundrel, being only a simple weapons specialist. The blue-haired knight looked furiously at his opponent with a core in his chest. It was a blue ball that studied matter along the axis, because the real Xavier has a heart of mana triple ring. He immediately swung his sword and cut the barrier. The knight looked away in confusion and tried to understand what it was, whether it was magic that controls gravity. At this time, Dark Max with a drooping look stretched out his fist in the sweat of his brow. The dark magician immediately soared into the sky to escape, but Thords was indignant at such a fate. Xavier immediately went to the swindler, who stretched out his hands in fear because they wanted him for his deception of honest people. The swindler immediately flew into the wooden barrels. The knight arrogantly raised his blade over the scoundrel and said that he would cut off his legs so that he could only crawl into court. He immediately tried to cut the air with his blade. The main character immediately stood in his way with an agitated look. Lloyd immediately began to furiously shout that Xavier had gone crazy, because if he got to court in such a state, then punishment awaited him. The blue-haired knight immediately wilted and was surprised. The main character looked angrily from under his brows at his knight, who did not understand why his master showed sympathy for others. Deep Night stood over the city on the mountain plain. At this time, the swindler was tied to chairs and looked ahead with an agitated look. Lloyd sat with folded hands opposite the swindler with a lost look. Then the brown-haired man waved his hand with a smile and asked Thords not to be afraid. The con man looked excitedly at the protagonist, who stated that when life is at stake, people tend to be greedy, and they will do anything when they get the chance. The protagonist sat opposite him, smiling, leaning on his hands, and stated that cutting off his head would be too cruel. The con man suggested that they were ready to forgive him, but he received a mocking answer that his secret would be taken to the grave. Lloyd smiled animatedly, closing his eyes and leaning his head on his fingers, asking Thords if he was grateful to him, because if so, why not give him all the money back? The con man began to smile with an ironic grin, and said that first he needed to be forgiven. The protagonist continued to look at him with a smile, closed his eyes, and said that he would receive forgiveness, because that was the meaning of their existence. The con man raised his eyebrows and looked at the protagonist in surprise. Then Tully excitedly exclaimed when the protagonist began to take out a piece of paper and said that he would have one more condition. Brown-haired smilingly handed over a piece of paper and a pen so that Thords would simply sign the contract and the matter would be decided. The swindler at this time looked closely at the piece of paper and tried to understand what kind of contract it was. As it turned out, it was a standard labor contract, and he would even receive money for it. Brown-haired continued to smile, resting his chin on his finger, and said that 80% of his salary would be withheld to pay off the debt. The protagonist crossed his arms and with a mocking smile said that in 520 years he would be able to pay him off. The swindler's eyes bulged in horror and his mouth opened. Xavier looked angrily at the smiling protagonist and realized that he should not have expected anything else, because he came here not to sympathize and forgive. The brown-haired man continued to twist his smile in a malicious manner, and he did not consider himself a fool to kill someone who owed him money, because he would definitely not make such a rash step. Then the brown-haired man brought the tube to Talia's head and began to suck it, because he said that he would squeeze all the juices out of him until the end of his worthless life. The swindler immediately exclaimed excitedly, because he was curious why he offered him such a slave contract. The main character looked at him in surprise and realized that Thords had now begun to speak differently. The main character looked at him intently with angry looks, said that they had no choice but to force him to sign this contract by force and resolve this issue in court. The swindler immediately began to sign this contract with tears in his eyes. White clouds floated in the sky. At this time, the cart was carrying the guys along a forest path. The main character was riding in the cart with the knight and the swindler. Xavier held the blade on his shoulder and said that he managed to get some money from it, because it was enough to pay the interest for a couple of months. Lloyd did not understand what was being discussed, because he was going to use all this money for construction, because they had already been through this and 30 workers were not enough. The main character with a dissatisfied grin and leaned his hands on the cart when Xavier explained that someone from the villagers had to respond to their job ad or his reputation would precede him. It was a mountain range of a plain where there were fields. A couple of days later, in the estate of the main character, there was a sign that labor was needed, where the salary was 20 gold, and for information they should contact the Baron's estate. A whole crowd of people stood in line at the table in front of the Baron. Xavier stood next to the Baron, who assumed that all these people must hate him, to which Xavier wanted to express his opinion. The blue-haired knight closed his eyes and said that Lloyd had undertaken to install the heating system on time and at a low price, punished the traitor of the estate and forced him to appear before the highest court. Xavier looked down on the Baron and realized that he wanted to be considered a reliable person who could be trusted. The brown-haired man's eyes widened in surprise, realizing that it was quite simple. The guy approached the counter where the Baron was sitting and asked him about the work. Lloyd replied that he only needed to sign the contract. The main character's eyes widened in slight surprise when they wanted to express their gratitude to him. The brunette with a red scarf around his neck, smiling, stretched out his hands and said that his child caught a cold very easily, as soon as it got a little cold. But thanks to the young master and his system, he had nothing to worry about this year. The brown-haired man looked in surprise at the bow of the man who thanked him. Lloyd immediately smiled animatedly, his eyes wide, and he felt relieved. Although he was just trying to satisfy his greed, he felt somehow awkward. Then the Baron looked at this guy, who informed that he had relatives from the Racona estate, which was nearby, and they wanted to know if he could install his system there too. The brown-haired man's eyes widened in bewilderment and he realized that this was the first step to prosperity. He immediately smiled bloodthirstily from under his bangs and realized that everything was not in vain, because he had to increase the price, explaining everything with travel expenses and take all the money for himself. Xavier stared at the Baron's malicious smile, who said that he would really need funds to deliver all the goods to the place, and the knight was confused by this strange expression, because he assumed that this whole construction had only one purpose. The brown-haired man, continuing to smile mockingly, extended his index finger. The blue-haired knight imagined the unfinished road. The protagonist stood with his knight on the edge of the mountain, looking into the vast distance. The knight looked at the smiling grin of the gentleman, who said that sooner or later there would be nothing left on this mountain. Lloyd continued to smile through his bangs and said that the heating system required a lot of resources and soon only stumps would remain from the trees here. Xavier frowned in bewilderment through his bangs. The knight held his blade behind his back and understood that if the gentleman knew the outcome, then why did he continue to do this? Lloyd replied that this was precisely why he was stopping the construction of the Appian Road. It was a dug trench leading up the mountain because he wanted to start mining coal. The main character threw the shovel behind his head and began to smile maliciously because he wanted to sell this coal at an inflated price. And as soon as the whole of their system reaches the masses, people simply will not be able to resist such a temptation. Xavier looked angrily at the smiling gentleman, who said that their residents would receive a discount, but a very small one, and considered it unfair. Lloyd looked closely at the dissatisfied knight and asked about whether he really considered him so ruthless. The protagonist kept his eyes on his knight and asked what would happen if he gave up on this idea, hinting that then they would hardly be able to pay off the debt for the estate. The blue-haired guy continued to look at the protagonist with displeasure. He immediately closed his eyes, holding the blade, and said that he would agree that now they had no other choice. Then Xavier looked at the protagonist again and said that the Baron did not know about coal, and when he found out, he would not leave it so easily. The knight looked at Lloyd, who lowered his head and explained to him that others had also tried to start mining again and again. The protagonist knew all this, so everything collapsed due to the fragility of the roadbed. Then he again smiled maliciously from under his brows and said that he would succeed. He imagined a huge technological drilling rig in the ground and said that thanks to modern technologies for excavation work, he would succeed because he knew the shield method of driving. The brown-haired man immediately raised the shovel over his head with joy and said that great things awaited them, but Xavier did not understand this technology unknown to him. At this time, a joyful Lloyd threw the shovel over his shoulder and walked forward, because Xavier wanted to see what this completely different gentleman could do. It was the same destroyed tunnel, littered with stones. This trench stretched straight to the entrance of the cave, which was littered with stones. It was a deep earthen cave. An ant's paw appeared. Then the antennae of an ant appeared. A bunch of red eyes peered out of the darkness. There were angry, bloodthirsty ants. These were large ants that crowded in this cave. Lloyd at this time clapped his hands. He began to rotate the magical green ring with a star with his hands, using spells. He then raised the ring above his head and emitted a green stream of light into the sky, wishing to summon a high-class apartment for himself. The green stream of light stretched far into the night sky. Then, the stream immediately evaporated into a shining star. Suddenly, a huge house returned with this stream of light. He wished he had such a cool skill. He sat at the table and boredly emitted green light into the drawing. He emitted green from his finger, trying to finish the drawing because it took too much time. Notification that this was a mid-level design, an underground outlet plan. He immediately leaned back in his chair and tiredly declared that he wanted to summon 100 immortal workers who did not need to be paid more. Then he put his hands on the drawing again and began to finish it. Thanks to the Newman incident, he was able to earn 639 RP, making a great impression on the Baron and Baroness, Xavier, Baron and others. It was a table of the level system with basic measurements and design. Because he invested points in pumping up his skills, he managed to get them. He stood on a rocky path near a collapsed cave, because he realized that they would be digging here. He looked ahead with his green grid skill, because it was an available mid-level skill, the underground scanning dimension. He scanned the entire space of the cave with green light and saw a room there, because this skill only allows you to see at a distance of 5 meters and will help you find the right direction. Then he stood with a puzzled look, touching his chin with his hand and trying to figure out how to drill a passage in the shortest time, because an ordinary person cannot do this, and besides, people get tired quickly. At this time, Peepodong was fast asleep under the blanket and fell ill while building the road. Even if he recovers, it will be dangerous to use it, because it is too big. The main character looked around through his bangs with displeasure and realized that he had no other choice. A window popped up in front of him with a random selection of a mystical creature that he had enough points for. He was sitting on the path, legs crossed, when a green light of appearance began to radiate in front of him. It was a green portal, from which a silhouette with a bow appeared. A snake girl with a bow on her head crawled out of this portal. This pink snake plopped down on the rocky path in front of the owner. This pink snake looked at the protagonist with admiration. The protagonist looked at her with bewilderment and assumed that at least she had poison, but she turned out to be completely harmless. But Peepodong also seemed like that at first, and perhaps this snake will be useful. The brown-haired man sat with his arms crossed and looked at the small pink snake, asking if she really increases in size after eating a sunflower seed, and if she also has superpowers. To which he received a positive answer. Lloyd smiled and stretched out his hand and asked to show the snake all its abilities. This pink beast with closed eyes smiled widely. A few weeks later, this path led to a tunnel under construction in a cave. This snake was chained in a wooden barrel and dug a tunnel, eating the earth, because the giant bell was moving inside the shield barrel. Then this pink snake chewed the earth, because it was called a bell and had the skill of digging the earth level 1. At this time, the main character with a battered look stretched out his hand, while the huge bell crawled nearby and told Xavier to get ready. At this time, the naked knight in a sweaty state held the blade in front of him. Then the bell released hot streams of metal from its hole. The knight at this time swung his blade to knock down the flying metal rods. Meanwhile, the other blacksmith workers were trying to forge a reliable support on the forge. Step 5 was the realization of the harsh reality, as Xavier, with a dejected look, thought about why a knight like him should mess with the remains of a giant snake. Then Lloyd, with a towel around his neck, raised his hand and began to shout for the guys to continue working. At this time, the workers were pushing a wooden barrel into the depths of the cave, moving towards the goal. Lloyd wiped his face from sweat, looking at the empty pipe, because due to the lack of oxygen, his head was spinning, and if they had not brought the pipe here, they would have passed out long ago. Then the brown-haired man looked at the knight behind him, who said that it was time for them to stop, because like the other workers, he needed to rest. Lloyd turned his head and said that he was in charge here and should monitor the progress of the work, as a responsible person usually does. He looked through his long bangs with a dissatisfied look and realized that in Korea the bosses only know how to talk, and there are even such scoundrels who have never visited the place of work. So he swore to himself that he would never become like that and would monitor the entire process himself. Then he used his vision, scanning. He looked at the wall and saw a room with a green light where there were pieces of coal. He immediately picked up the shovel and began to rejoice with the rest of the workers that they were almost there and there was still a little left. Then Lloyd looked with a smile at the bell that was pressed to his face, and he thanked them for the fact that they did it many times faster. Then Lloyd looked back at the crowd of workers and his knight, giving an order that as soon as they reached the coal seam, they should dismantle the shield and expand the space. He looked at his workers near the stone wall and said that this was a rather dangerous undertaking, so everyone needed to be extremely careful. Then he looked back at the hole in the wall, hearing a strange sound. He continued to look at this layer of earth, listening to various sounds. He stared at the layer of earth with the other workers and realized that the earth cover here was strong and should not collapse. Then he began to look forward with a close underground scan with a green light. With this scan in the green room, he saw a crack in the wall and realized that it was not there before. He continued to watch this crack, seeing that it was growing. Suddenly, a huge bloodthirsty ant broke through the wall. Lloyd fell to the ground when the ant was about to attack him. Lloyd immediately grabbed his blade and was about to save his master. He swung his blade, looking at the bloodthirsty monster. Lloyd also did not want to stay aside and ran with his shovel. He delivered a crushing blow to the monster's head with the tool. With just one blow of the shovel, he flattened the ant's head. He looked at the corpse with a malicious look in the sweat of his brow and realized that this was an amazing thing, because something had appeared that was not said a word about in the novel. Then the knight together with the main character looked into a huge hole from where the black eyes of the other monsters appeared. These insects with a bloodthirsty look began to crawl in all directions. Lloyd immediately waved his hand at his workers, who began to run away in horror to the exit. At this time, Lloyd swung his blade and chopped all the monsters. The main character with an angry look, baring his teeth, tried to understand how many monsters were here, because if they got out, then they were finished. Xavier, out of breath, drew his blade, and Lloyd counted on him, but there was too little air here. At this time, the rest of the workers ran out of the mine, and he realized that it could not be destroyed without explosives, but even if the structure fell, there was a chance that the monsters would crawl out and tried to figure out what to do. At this time, Xavier slapped his master so that he would pull himself together and not panic. Then the enraged protagonist looked at the fighting knight and said that he did not panic, but thought. The angry knight looked back and said that he would not be able to hold back the monsters for long. Brown-haired held his shovel tightly, baring his teeth and thinking about what to do here with a tunnel with ants, coal, and a dungeon. It was an ordinary light bulb in a black space. Then this light bulb began to emit streams of discharges in all directions above the protagonist's head. Lloyd immediately grabbed the torch in the wall. He took his shovel and torch and shouted to the knight that they needed to move forward to attack. The blue-haired knight continued to grin furiously and realized that it sounded crazy, but he ran to attack. Xavier then deftly cut all the ant bodies with his blade because he realized that there was a point in this. The main character bloodthirstily ran to attack with his torch together with the knight. From the palace came screams that there was bad news for the Baron. Arcus opened his mouth in horror, hearing about the mutant ants and trying to understand where his son was. He immediately opened his armor cabinet, and the assistant said that all the workers were successfully evacuated, but Sir Xavier was still there and Baron would soon seal the entrance to the mine. Arcus immediately began to put on his armor and wanted to hurry, tightening his belt. Xavier bloodthirstily chopped the ants, from which blue splashes of blood flew. The knight held the blade in front of him, looking back with anger, trying to understand why there were more and more ants. The protagonist at this time held a torch and shouted that now was not the time for talking, because he was very busy. They stood back to back and fought off the mutant ants from all sides, because he understood that it was good that they did not come out of their holes, but the situation itself was very terrible. The knight bowed his head and fought with anger, because he was almost at the limit and did not care that it was hot here and little air, but there were a lot of ants. At this time, the protagonist angrily bared his teeth, using his scanning vision, because he was trying to find methane in the dungeon. They continued to fight the ants, standing next to each other in the cave. He understood that coal was a place where methanogens were spreading, and because of this, layers of methane gas were hidden under all the mineral veins. He pulled out his burning torch and tried to understand, if he could only find it, he would blow up all the ants. Then he looked closely at his knight behind him. With his scan, he looked at the ground and saw a piece of a layer of methane gas. He immediately stuck his shovel into the ground and was about to dig. He spread his legs wide and began to dig the ground, looking back at the knight and giving him the order to hold off the monsters. He immediately began to furiously dig the ground quickly. At this time, a huge ant tried to attack him. Xavier at this time swung his blade. While Lloyd was digging, Xavier, at this time, dealt with the rest of the monsters. Cutting the air around with his blade, he cut down the monsters, protecting the master. They immediately covered their ears from the loud earthquake and noise. A huge main ant appeared. The guys raised their heads in horror and realized that it was the queen ant. This huge monster immediately began to attack the guys. At this time, the brown-haired guy and the knight held their weapons and stared intently at the monster. Lloyd tried to ask his fighter if he could defeat her, to which he received a refusal. The brown-haired guy ironically said that if he did not try, he would not know, although Xavier understood that there were things that he could not do, even if he did not try it. The blue-haired guy put the blade behind his head and said that at the moment they still had no other choice. The queen ant furiously flew to attack. The knight immediately raised his blade and a blue core began to grow above it. He immediately attacked the belly of the queen monster with his blade. This bloodthirsty ant immediately fell into a stupor. The knight bloodthirstily stuck the tip of his blade into the monster's belly. Then he waved his weapon away from the monster. At this time, the brown-haired man continued to furiously dig the ground and understood that there was no time to lose, so he wanted his knight to hold out longer. At this time, the blue-haired knight swung his blade, fighting off the attack of the bloodthirsty queen of monsters. He stuck his shovel into the hole, and a stream of gas was heard from there. The brown-haired man immediately bared his teeth angrily in bewilderment. Lloyd immediately ran to his torch to grab it and told his fighter to run faster to the entrance. They began to run away from the cave and the monster was chasing them. It was an earthen cave where the chopped parts of the monsters lay, because they noticed a narrow passage that they had already used. The knight ran after the protagonist, who was holding a torch in his hands. Then our hero looked back, trying to throw the torch away. He immediately released a fiery torch towards the hole. This torch first hit the head and then flew off the ant. The fiery torch continued to fly into the depths of the cave, bouncing off the ground. The Queen of Monsters was about to finish off the prostrate main character. This flow of gas from the ground began to intensify. Suddenly, the entire space of the cave began to be enveloped in fire. A powerful fiery explosion occurred. The knight covered the master with his body when the explosion occurred. The ants watched the growing fiery explosion. It was a powerful surge of fiery energy. The knight continued to press the protagonist to the ground, protecting him with his body. At this time, Arcus, along with other knights and assistants, stood at the entrance to the mine. Daeron tried to hold Arcus, who was about to run in armor to save his son. After the explosion, the battered Xavier continued to press Lloyd with his body. The brown-haired man at this time held his ears, grimacing. Then he began to get up, looking at the fallen Queen Ant and realized that her plan worked. Then he looked closely at the lying knight and realized that he protected him. Then he picked up the pink snake and apologized to her for being in such a state. Then he looked up at the entrance. He saw that their entrance was completely blocked. He began to get up, leaning his hand on the shovel, and his ears were ringing. A notification popped up that there was a lack of oxygen. He looked ahead with his scanning vision in displeasure. He again saw the entrance with the help of scanning and realized that he needed to dig through faster, but he also had to dig more than 5 meters. A bar with the oxygen level appeared, which was already running out. He stuck the shovel into the ground and was about to dig because they had no other way out. At this time, the battered Xavier raised his gaze. With his cloudy vision, he saw Lloyd digging the ground and shouting that they should get out together. The knight continued to lose consciousness and barely saw Lloyd's silhouette, who wanted to save them all. Then the blue-haired knight fell unconscious, hanging his head. A notification from the system appeared, which admired his act of not abandoning the knight. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of him had increased by +6. Received 108 RP, accumulated 157. The completely out-of-breath protagonist tried to catch his breath in the sweat of his brow, a notification with an oxygen level that was already on the edge. He understood that he had nothing more to lose and the oxygen level had noticeably decreased. The brown-haired man threw the shovel behind his head and frowned in the sweat of his brow, turning to the system because he wanted to find a search for knowledge that could develop skills. The system overload appeared. The main character stood with an angry look in the blue circle of the system. A message popped up that knowledge was detected and the absorption of the surrounding mana began. It was a bunch of pop-up notifications where, by combining these skills, he would be able to master the technique of the Azrahan core. He smiled maliciously, raising his fist, and was glad that he had not given up training since the duel with Newman and would be able to develop his skill as he wanted. His system asked in the window whether he wanted to master this technique, and he agreed. He spread his legs wide and began to absorb the blue color because he had acquired the skill of the aura. A glimmer of blue appeared in space. This ray of light began to circulate in space. His gray silhouette looked calm when the beam of light enveloped his heart, and he felt it all, but unfortunately, he did not have mana in his heart, but he could feel the presence of rings. Notification that mana had expanded by 120%. He slightly pressed his lips and realized that if he were an ordinary person, even if he trained hard, he might not get the result right away. But he had RP. A window with the Azrahan core technique popped up where he was going to increase the level in one click. He immediately pressed the increase skill key with his finger and inserted everything. He spread his legs wide again, began to study the blue light because he had increased the level of the core technique. Notification that mana had expanded by 125%. Then he again wanted to increase the level and pressed the corresponding key. He furiously continued to increase his level by pressing the key. But he tried to figure out if he would need these points later, but now he had no choice and would level up as long as he could. Out of breath, he stretched his finger to the system window, wanting to level up. Rays of blue light filled the space with them. The protagonist looked at the ongoing technique of the dual ring core in surprise, and the mana increased by 200%. A message that 100 points were needed before increasing the next level, but he only had 7 left. He bared his teeth with a shabby look and tried to figure out how things were now and whether the number of rings had increased. A window appeared where he had an available skill, and he couldn't help but feel tired for 10 minutes. Message with an available skill is an energy burst, where there was an expansion of mana, which will increase by 3 times for 20 seconds. He bloodthirstily grabbed his shovel, baring his teeth and wanting to go further. He raised the shovel over his head with a bloodthirsty expression and emitted light discharges into the entire space. He began to dig even harder at a fast pace. A message about the oxygen level, which was almost running out. The protagonist bared his teeth with a furious look and really wanted to see the flow of oxygen. With the help of scanning, he saw a room and wanted to find just a small opening, because if he could only find a crack, he would be able to breathe. He continued to dig the ground with his shovel, creating a cave. After a moment, he had already excavated a significant part of the cave. A red message about the oxygen level approaching 0. He stared ahead with a piercing gaze with the help of scanning, sweating. With the help of scanning, he saw a hole in the wall and saw an exit. Screams and dust from excavations were heard from the cave. At this time, the knight lay unconscious along with the pink snake. Lloyd continued to bloodthirstily dig the tunnel. A red message about the oxygen level was already running out. The protagonist opened his mouth wide, wanting to find a way out. That same red notification that the oxygen was already running out. With the help of scanning, he saw this hole, which was about 3 meters away. He fell to his knees. He also dropped his shovel. He was sitting on his knees with a dejected look, because the effect of the skills had ceased. While Xavier and the snake lay unconscious, Lloyd was sitting on his knees. He immediately thought about the release of energy, grabbed the shovel again and jumped up with a bloodthirsty look. He began to dig the ground again with an intensified look. With the help of scanning, he almost approached the hole, because there was very little left for it. Notification of the oxygen level, which was completely over. The main character fell to the ground unconscious. Everything ended quickly. He lay on the ground with a half-dead look and realized that as the son of a nobleman living in a remote area, he only dreamed of a quiet life. Then he closed his eyes. He lay on his stomach, on the ground near the shovel. Suddenly there was a sound. The brown-haired man slightly opened his eyes, convulsively tried to stick, looking at the cave, hearing the sounds. Suddenly, Peepadong burst through the hole in the ground with a joyful look. Lloyd, with a joyful look, bulged his eyes with a smile. He immediately opened his mouth wide and began to inhale fresh air. Then, with the help of a shovel, he was going to get up and understood that a quiet life was definitely waiting for him. The night blue moon illuminated the mountain plain. A hot torch was in the cave. Arcus, along with the rest of the fighters, went inside with the help of torches. Bayern walked next to him and said that it was dangerous to go further, but the Baron asked everyone to go back, and he himself would go to the end. Arcus stared ahead with a torch. He saw 2 silhouettes when his son carried a knight. The protagonist with a tired look carried his faithful comrade on his back. A message popped up that using exceptional skills in an emergency situation had helped him surpass the limits of human ability, and the special case coupled with the skill of Azrahan's core technique had a strong effect on him. Notification: with the available skill of the power mode, even when he was greatly exhausted, traces of the core technique could still have an effect. Arcus immediately dropped the torch and ran to his son. The protagonist, looking tired, carried the body of the unconscious knight. The brown-haired man and the unconscious knight fell into Arcus's arms. A large blue moon was visible through the black clouds. It was the next morning at dawn in a flat town. A man in a suit carried a wooden box, looked back at the janitor and said that he thought this young gentleman was an idiot, but it turned out that this was not the case. The sun's rays illuminated the houses of the town, and the man said that his nephew was in the thick of things. He saw everything himself. When the giant ants attacked, the master's first thought was to save the workers, and the rumors were true. It was a busy street, the town, when these guys talked to each other and said that Lloyd and the knight remained in the mine, and they heard that they killed all the monsters. And then the main character carried the knight on his shoulders. The rising sun enveloped the flat town, and they realized that this guy was different from the same Lloyd they knew. At this time, the knight was sitting on a chair in front of the protagonist, who was lying on the bed. Lloyd was lying on a pillow with his eyes closed. Then he began to open his eyes. Xavier immediately exclaimed. Notification that the inhabitants of their estate were deeply impressed by his heroic actions and did not stop praising him. The main character looked at the status window with a half-dead look. A system message popped up that he would be rewarded with additional points for outstanding achievements, and his balance was replenished to 507. The main character immediately raised his eyebrows in surprise and realized that he had become a hero. Then he looked ahead with a smile. A white rocky path led to a cave. The workers continued to rebuild and construct it. Then they began to look around in surprise. They saw that the main character entered the cave with a knight. The workers immediately began to bow before them and greeted them for their merits. The worker looked at his savior with an admiring look and a sullen grin, because he was different from other nobility and was a true example of nobility. The brown-haired man with a downcast look and an ironic grin felt awkward. A burning torch illuminated the cave, because 2 weeks had passed since the ant incident and work in the stone mine was in full swing. The brown-haired man walked with a torch into the narrow gorge of the cave, because in such a turbulent time, their safety should come first, and he should avoid even the slightest occurrence of danger. The two of them walked into the caves with torches, and the knight said that today they were looking for ant trails and wanted to ask a question. Lloyd replied that there was no point in wasting oxygen on the post and wanted to quickly talk. The protagonist looked back at the knight behind him, who asked why he himself constantly exposed himself to danger, because he could just order others to do it for him. Xavier looked closely at the gentleman and realized that it could not be that he was interested in the safety of ordinary workers, and said that he, as the future heir to the estate, should be more careful. The knight looked at the back of the brown-haired man, who walked in front, and called him a fool. The protagonist continued to walk forward with his shovel torch and stated that he must, so it is to bear responsibility for all possible risks. Xavier was slightly surprised. Lloyd looked at him mockingly, looked back and said that in this case, even if he throws money around, no one will dare to say anything to him. Xavier continued to look at the protagonist with bewilderment and tried to understand whether it was good or bad. Notification that the level of his sympathy for him was about to increase, but suddenly changed his mind. The two of them came to a dead end in the cave and realized that it was worth looking in another place. Still, the brown-haired man tried to look around with his scanning vision and realized that there was a hollow space. He immediately began to dig the ground, and Xavier realized that he wanted to make sure of this personally, because this is where the queen could lay her eggs, and if the eggs did not hatch later, then they must kill them. The main character made his way into a new space in a narrow gorge. He saw tied piglets and an orc tied with a web. They entered a cave where the domestic animals were completely covered in webs, and there was also a green orc. The knight immediately wanted to get his blade, but Lloyd calmed him down because he did not see any danger here, because surprisingly he was behaving recklessly now. It was a green orc girl, and Xavier tried to understand what kind of creature it was. The main character came closer and held out a torch, assuming that the monster could die. The knight explained that this was unlikely because he had heard that ants prefer to keep their prey, having previously paralyzed it. The brown-haired man immediately smiled maliciously, spreading into a wide sarcastic grin. He realized that this was an incredible find. Then they were transferred to the palace again. It was a rescued orc named Harach who stated that Lloyd was his savior and he would never forget his deed. This orc was sitting on the bed in front of the protagonist, who was sitting on a chair opposite and trying to understand his accent, which he could use for his character. Harach turned out to be the son of the chieftain of the orc tribe, and thanks to the care of the healer, he came to his senses very quickly. Harach came with a fist of his chest and declared that he was the son of the chieftain of the Steel Sand tribe and would never forget the kindness of the main character and would give him everything he wanted. The protagonist with a mocking grin touched his chin and realized that he saved this guy for personal gain. They immediately leaned towards each other. The brown-haired man with a spreading smile asked the orc to call a bunch of his comrades to help in the mines. The green man looked at him with bewilderment and refused. The protagonist slightly drooped and was horrified. Then Lloyd smiled again and tried to understand the reason. The green man replied that the guy just clicked his tongue and looked like a bad person, but Lloyd said that it was just a habit. Harach pointed at himself and said that they were warriors, and warriors only followed orders from their commander. The protagonist crossed his arms in confusion and thought that this was a problem, because he was not considered a warrior, which meant he could not order them around. The protagonist imagined a powerful orc with a severed ant head. He noted that he had heard that orcs, upon reaching adulthood, must go into the wild and bring back the head of a giant ant, but Harach made the mistake of going to the ant lair, where he was immediately immobilized. Lloyd pressed his lips together. He then began to lick them with his tongue. The protagonist smiled widely, clapping his hands. He said that nothing could be done, congratulating Harach on his coming of age. The orc looked down with a sad look. He said that he failed his task and did not catch the giant ant, and he could not move and fell. Lloyd asked what he was talking about. The protagonist pointed to the head of the huge ant with a wide smile. He asked the orc that they had not caught it together. The orc looked at the ant's head with confusion, saying that he did not remember catching such a huge ant. The brown-haired man said that, of course, he did not remember anything because he was unconscious. After which the guy put his hand on the orc's shoulder, looking at him with a serious look. He noted that he had witnessed a truly impressive sight, and when he reached the lair, he saw the queen shaking with fear. Lloyd looked at Harach with a cold look. He stated that the queen screamed that she did not believe that she had lost to the young orc. Harach asked if this was true and that the ant monsters understood their speech. Lloyd noted that they had succeeded in this quite well. Xavier looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. The protagonist said that thanks to him, it was much easier to find their lair. The protagonist approached the orc from behind, after which he looked at him from the other side, saying that in general they caught that giant ant together. The protagonist and the orc looked at the ant's head in surprise. Lloyd looked at Harach with a wide smile, saying that he was an unrivaled warrior, and Lloyd too. Harach looked at the hero in confusion, saying about an unrivaled warrior. The hero narrowed his eyes sarcastically, asking him about 120 orcs. The orc looked at the protagonist with confidence, clenching his hand into a fist, noting that they were his. White clouds floated above the mountains. A week later, there were tents among the mountains, the village of the Steel Sand Orc tribe. Lloyd noted that this was how their long journey in search of labor ended. Akuch sat on the throne, looking at you with a serious look. He told Lloyd that he was very sorry, but they would not be able to fulfill his request. The protagonist looked at the orc in shock, wondering why he was backing out. The protagonist smiled in confusion, pressing his hand to his chest. He turned to the great chief of the Steel Sand tribe, Akuch, asking if he could know the reason for his refusal. The chief closed his eyes, saying that they were not strong enough to complete this task, and in order to maintain their strength, they needed to eat meat, and if they did not hunt, their muscles would weaken. Behind the chieftain stood a sad Harach. Akuch said that losing their strength would lead to the fall of the tribe, and they could not reduce the number of warriors since they were needed for hunting. The protagonist asked that they hunt every day. Akuch looked down at the protagonist, saying that this was true, and their muscles would weaken if they did not eat meat. The protagonist thought that he was an idiot with his muscles. Xavier looked at the thoughtful protagonist, saying that for them, proteins and muscles are the meaning of life, and it would be better to abandon this idea. Lloyd slightly opened his mouth, saying that he heard them. Then he spread his arms out to the sides, asking that if the meat did not spoil for several days, then they would not have to hunt constantly, and they could lend them workers. The chieftain nodded his head, saying that everything was right and they wanted to pay him back, but when it came to their strength, Lloyd moved his leg to the side, asking what it meant. It was possible. The protagonist leaned slightly, smiling contentedly. He asked the chief what if they had the ability to keep the meat fresh for a while. The protagonist noted that they needed to go back a little and remember the time when they first arrived at the village. Harach looked ahead with tears in his eyes at his father's ties. Akuch, with tears in his eyes, met his son. Harach suddenly rushed towards the chief. Akuch bounced off the ground, heading towards his son. The father and son ran towards each other, after which they hugged each other tightly. A huge wave of energy came from their collision. The protagonist narrowed his eyes in bewilderment, watching what was happening. He noted that it was just a hug, but the effect of it was so destructive, and if he stood between them, he would have been ground into powder. The protagonist grinned wickedly, thinking that if he were to get 120 of these brave craftsmen, their productivity would skyrocket 1,000-fold. Lloyd noted that there was something else that deserved attention. Harach presented his father with a huge ant head, telling him to watch as he had brought the head of the queen ant. The orcs began to raise their fists in the air. The chieftain shouted to his son that he was proud of him and that this day would be a holiday. The orcs began to squat with objects on their shoulders, saying that they were just training. The brown-haired man watched what was happening in bewilderment. A golden pillar was visible on the orc's shoulders. The protagonist looked at the pillar in shock, wondering what they were doing with these golden things. The orcs were training with golden objects. Lloyd noted that it felt like they were pulling them out of thin air. The orc was clutching a golden lamp in his hand. The protagonist noted that these things were more expensive than any other sports equipment. The protagonist grinned wickedly, holding a shovel in his hands. He stated that this is why he signed a contract with the chieftain for the construction, so that they would get both labor and treasure. Xavier looked at the piece of paper carefully. He said that they would build a stone cold storage, and in return they would get all sorts of expensive trinkets, but they would need special equipment to work with stone. The blue-haired guy looked at the protagonist curiously, asking what kind of stone cold storage was this. He thought that he had never heard of such a thing. The protagonist imagined a stone building. Lloyd asked the guy that he knew that the royal mages could keep food fresh using ice magic, noting that the cold storage was a building where he could do the same thing, only without magic. Xavier looked at the protagonist warily, asking how he knew all this. The brown-haired man said that he heard it from the circle. The guy asked what a circle was. The main character said that he was too lazy to explain, asking why he knew so little. After which he pointed his hand at the rock, saying that they would need a special kind of stone for the refrigerator. Granite, it is very strong. The guys looked at the rock. Xavier noted that something told him that it would not be easy to get it. Lloyd noted that this was true and it would not be easy. The protagonist pursed his lips, thinking that they did not have dynamite either, but they had an excellent replacement. The brown-haired man looked at the blue-haired guy, saying about the turn. The hero smiled slyly, thinking that he had one person in mind with dynamite. The blue-haired guy thought that, apparently, he was going to use it again. Lloyd noted that this is one of the key moments of the novel Night of Iron and Blood. A purple barrier towered over the city. Shaitan noted that this was Namaram. People looked at the purple barrier in horror. The protagonist noted that this was a city trapped inside a magical barrier and thousands of refugees were locked inside the city, whom Xavier had to save. The swordsman watched in horror. Lloyd noted that by that time Xavier had almost become a master of the sword, and his mana heart had the 4th mana ring, and he helplessly watched as mana was sucked out of the hearts of the captives. The swordsman bared his teeth, swinging his blade. He noted that he must save them even at the cost of his life. The protagonist noted that in this way, he himself, without knowing it, created a deadly technique. A blue energy sphere appeared in space. Xavier noted that it was necessary to protect Mana's main heart with 1 ring and the other 3 rings. An energy explosion occurred in space. Xavier noted that a blow would follow. The swordsman put his hand with the blade in front of him. He used the explosion skill. A fireball appeared from the guy. The fireball made a hole in the purple barrier above the city. The barrier began to dissolve. Brown-haired noted that later this explosion became the same technique that represented the Night of Iron and Blood along with the Israhan Mind technique. The main character with an iron face smiled widely, asking that they cannot use such a technique. The swordsman looked at the character in bewilderment, asking how he knew this theory. The brown-haired guy said that he really had this idea for the first time, and he should look into his eyes, ask him what he thinks. He's lying. The protagonist was winding a strand of hair around his finger. The swordsman said that he was right and his eyes were terribly annoying, and he saw lies in them. Lloyd asked that he didn't believe him. Then he smiled widely, spreading his arms out to the sides. He said to just try, and he hoped that Xavier's skill would only improve from this. The blue-haired guy noted that he knew that he would still do it his way. Lloyd asked what he was talking about, suggesting that they always wish each other only the best. The protagonist looked at the swordsman's back with a sly grin. Xavier said that if the theory was correct, then he would only benefit from it. Lloyd thought that if he succeeded, he would also make every effort. The swordsman put the weapon in front of him, thinking that he needed to protect the heart of the mana with 1 ring and the other 3 rings. Xavier plunged his blade into the rock, noting that he needed to release it. A bright light appeared from the rock. The protagonist watched what was happening in bewilderment, wondering if this was a success on the first try. Clouds of smoke rose, among which a black silhouette of a guy was visible. From the clouds of smoke, Xavier appeared with torn clothes. The swordsman looked at the protagonist with displeasure, asking if he had planned everything on purpose. The brown-haired man noted that he had not at all, and he was sorry that it had turned out this way. The swordsman sighed heavily, putting the blade back in its sheath. He said that in any case, this time his idea worked, now it was his turn. The system announced that Xavier was grateful for the lesson and the sympathy level Xavier had increased by +3. The system announced that the sympathy level was -11. The system announced that he had earned 54 RP, improving relations with key characters and a total RP of 561. The swordsman turned his back to the protagonist. He said that he knew that he was a knight and his skills should be used to protect the Baron, and he was using them in construction. The brown-haired man grinned maliciously, saying that he did not need thanks. The knight looked back at the brown-haired man with a cold gaze, saying that he was not grateful at all. Lloyd noted that the construction had been progressing quickly since then. A huge peapodong stood next to the protagonist. The protagonist noted that the granite that Xavier had split and shaped had been delivered to the peapodong construction site. The man looked at the orc with bewilderment, who waved his hand. The orc told the man that he would only strain his back like that, and he would show him how it should be done. The men watched as the orcs carried stones. The protagonist said that he did not even ask them to do this, but the orcs, addicted to training, did all the work themselves. The orcs said that this was like a regular training, and now it was necessary to let it go. The protagonist watched with curiosity what was happening, thinking that at this rate they would finish the construction 5 times faster. Lloyd looked ahead with a serious look, noting that now they only needed ice and insulation. Xavier stood next to the protagonist. Lloyd asked the knight that he had sent workers for insulation material, and that it was a long time ago. The swordsman noted that exactly 3 weeks had passed. The protagonist looked at the knight with caution, asking that then it was time for them to return already. The swordsman turned his gaze to the brown-haired man, noting that there were 2 possible options. Either the soldiers were too lazy, or the protagonist frowned, saying that something had happened to them. After which he stood up, saying that they needed to find out everything. Xavier put his hand in front of the main character. He looked at the brown-haired man with a serious look, said that if the task was to take place in this, then he would go one, and he did not know exactly what could have happened and thought that he should not go. The brown-haired man squinted at the knight, asking that they had already discussed this. The protagonist put his hand to his side, noting that he was in charge of the construction and was responsible for the workers. Xavier closed his eyes and sighed heavily. Lloyd said that it was time to go. White clouds floated over the deserted cliffs. A glove lay in the middle of the road. The protagonist leaned towards the glove, picking it up. He noted that these were the gloves he ordered for insulation work. Xavier squinted and looked away, calling out to the protagonist. The guys were standing on the edge of a cliff. Xavier said that there was some kind of strange atmosphere in this gorge. Lloyd asked how strange it was. The brown-haired man looked at the knight in bewilderment. The swordsman said that the flow of mana there was quite unusual, and there was no accuracy since everything was blurred. Lloyd wondered what was blurred and what kind of gorge this was. The protagonist looked ahead thoughtfully, noting that he had seen something like this on the pages of the novel Knight of Iron and Blood, after which he looked ahead dumbfounded. The main character abruptly went the other way, telling Xavier that they were leaving and that they had little time. The knight asked what he had discovered. The brown-haired man looked ahead with a frightened look, declaring that their soldiers might no longer be alive. Xavier looked at the protagonist in horror. White clouds were floating above the rocks. The protagonist stood on the ground in front of the straw, after which he leaned over to it, taking it in his hand. Lloyd was squeezing the straw in his hand. The guys approached the cave. The protagonist noted that this was the Ruffleland Gorge. The guys looked at the cave with a serious look. Brown-haired noted that at the very beginning of the novel, this place was mentioned as one of Xavier's goals, and the Dark Mage Ruffleland was hiding there. Lloyd wondered how he dared to touch their soldiers. Brown-haired's face twisted into a furious grimace. He wondered if entering private property was equated to a sin. The knight entered the cave, taking hold of his blade. He told the master to follow him. Lloyd asked to wait for him. Xavier stepped on the magic circle with his foot. The protagonist grabbed the swordsman by the coat, pulling him towards himself. An explosion occurred in front of the guys. They stood with their backs to the hole in the ground. The knight asked if it was a magic trap. The protagonist looked at the guy in bewilderment, asking if he was sure he was a knight, noting that he should calculate such moments in advance. Lloyd imagined the image of a wounded Xavier. He thought that in the novel, Xavier fell into the same trap when he was wounded and looking for cover. The knight slightly opened his mouth, after which he continued his way through the cave. Lloyd noted that their Xavier never makes mistakes twice. The brown-haired man pointed his finger to the side, asking what he said, that the flow of mana there is unusual. I suggest using my technique there too. The swordsman closed his eyes and spread his arms to the sides. The protagonist said that in a natural environment, mana has a constant concentration in the atmosphere. Blue particles of mana were flying in space. The hero said that this way he would be able to understand where the magical traps were. The blue energy particles connected with each other. Lloyd noted that he felt an unusual concentration of mana. Xavier looked ahead with a serious look. The protagonist followed the knight with a smile. The blue-haired guy said that they should go there. The protagonist noted that his senses were well sharpened. The swordsman looked away warily, thinking that he only does what he lies and insists, but now everything is different. The protagonist threw the shovel over his shoulder, following the swordsman. Xavier wondered what was going on, adding that he predicts events before they happen. The swordsman continued to follow the road, wondering how, and he does not feel any special energy, but could it be such a powerful mana? The blue-haired guy pursed his lips, thinking that first they need to figure out what awaits them ahead. The boys continued their way through the cave. The swordsman noted that they needed to save the hostages as quickly as possible. In the cave stood a man in black robes with a hood over his head, after which he looked back with a serious look. The boy stood near a table with books. He wondered if the trap had worked and someone had come to them, and who it could be. The man slammed the book shut, saying that he would find out soon, after which he approached the door, noting that he thought his preparations were complete. The man moved the lock on the door, thinking that his experiment would be successful. There were tied men in a locked room. The guy said he hoped. The mage pulled the guy out of the room by his hair, who begged for mercy. Then he threw the man into a magic circle. The mage picked up a scythe, looking in front of him with a terrifying look. He said that this was a magic circle that connected with hell and the merciless scythe of the Reaper, waiting for its time for 100 days in a vessel with blood and a young life. The mage swung his scythe, saying that it was perfect. The man closed his eyes, screaming loudly. The protagonist called out to the guy in the robe. The guy looked back with a crazy look. The brown-haired man looked at the guy with an enraged look, telling him not to touch him. Ruffalen put his hand in front of himself, creating a magic circle. He asked that they were crazy people, wondering how they got around all the traps. The guys stood in front of Ruffalen, after which a wall appeared in front of them. A wall soon appeared behind the guys. The protagonist opened his mouth wide, taking in air. Lloyd stood with his cheeks puffed out. The guys were ready for battle. Ruffalen smiled maliciously, thinking that he would put them to sleep with magic and then get even. The protagonist's eyes began to glow green. He thought that he was a lively guy. The system notified that he would not feel tired for 10 minutes. The brown-haired man began to furiously dig the ground, thinking that a couple of minutes would be enough for him, because now he was no longer in an ant tunnel. Xavier began to rub his eyes. Lloyd noted that Xavier had never taken medication for insomnia, so no sleeping pill would work on him. The protagonist dug a hole in the ground, noting that he had already gone too far. The knight looked down with a serious look, thinking that he looked like a mole, and when the opportunity presented itself, he would laugh at it. The protagonist began to point his finger to the knight, thinking that he should quickly go there. The swordsman stood in the tunnel, swinging his weapon. Energy appeared around the blade. The knight thrust his blade into the wall. He used the explosion skill. A pillar of fire appeared in front of the magician, after which he fell to the ground in horror, watching what was happening. A huge hole appeared in the ground. The protagonist's hand rose from the hole. Lloyd began to rise from the tunnel. He fell out of the hole, looking at the magician with a terrifying look, saying that he had never seen such a huge monster before. Ruffalen bared his teeth, creating magic circles, thinking that he had never seen such a huge monster. The magician pressed his hands to the ground, creating a huge magic circle. A huge monster with 2 heads appeared behind the magician. The man smiled madly, thinking that even though his experiment had failed, this was his most powerful creation. A huge, terrifying monster stood before the boys. The mage thought that they should at least try to scratch his steel armor. The protagonist looked away in confusion, saying that they would have a hard time in his weak legs. Lloyd looked at Xavier in bewilderment, who jumped into the air. The swordsman delivered a fiery slashing blow to the monster, using the skill Ripping Wave. Xavier cut the monster in half. Ruffalen watched in horror. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. He wondered if he could use the power of the explosion as an auxiliary force and cut in half. Xavier leaned slightly, putting his weapon back in its sheath. Lloyd wondered why the novel didn't mention this technique. The boys stood in a pompous stance. The mage looked at the guys with horror, thinking that he was in trouble and no matter what he did, he would not be able to defeat them. The protagonist squatted down next to the man. He looked at the mage with a terrifying look, saying that he had kidnapped their soldiers and now their construction had stopped because of him, asking how he was going to pay him. Ruffalen bowed before the protagonist, thinking that it would be better for him to lie down on the ground for now because he had to survive by any means. The mage said that he had committed a great sin and was begging for forgiveness. Lloyd noted that he should not say that, and he was asking about compensation for the damage caused. The man looked ahead with horror, saying that there were many valuable things there and he would give them everything. The protagonist grinned slyly, asking that this was true, and therefore it was all his. The man said that of course he could take everything. Xavier pulled the worker out of the room by the arm, telling the master that the soldiers were severely exhausted, but their lives were not in danger. Lloyd said that was great and he was glad to hear it. The protagonist looked at the mage with a cold gaze, saying that in a couple of days they would have been dead, asking what he was going to do with them. The mage bared his teeth, saying that he was doing research, trying to find out how to bring the dead back to life. The protagonist looked at the man with disdain, asking what was even possible and why he needed to know. The man narrowed his eyes. He continued to sit, bowing in front of the protagonist. Ruffalen stated that it was to bring back his wife and son. The protagonist looked at the mage with a serious look. Ruffalin remembered how he held his son in his arms with a smile and looked at his wife. He said that he was a mage in the house of a baron and lived an ordinary life with his family, and not just an ordinary one, he was happy. Ruffalin imagined the baron holding out his hand, and then the happy picture cracked. He said that the baron he served, he suddenly wanted to take his wife away from him, so he tried to escape with them. The protagonist closed his eyes, opening his mouth wide. Ruffalin said that the baron was chasing them. Lloyd told him to stop and that he was good at sculpting. He looked at the mage with a serious look, asking what it meant. If he saved his wife and son, they would thank him for killing hundreds of innocent lives and saving them, and that he thought they would thank him like that. The man looked at the protagonist with bewilderment. The brown-haired man noted that the ghouls he created. The hero looked at the man with a cold look. He asked that the lives of the people he sacrificed, their families, their happiness, and for him it all meant nothing, adding that he did not think that his story deserved pity. Xavier watched the events with a serious look. Brown-haired man told him not to speak, his true nature cannot be changed. Ruffalin looked down with a sad look. Brown-haired man noted that he had destroyed the happiness of so many families, and he would forever remain a murderer. Tears began to flow from the mage's eyes. The hero pressed his lips together. He rose to his feet, saying that he would return later with reinforcements and take all of his magical items. The protagonist turned his back to the man, noting that if he tried to harm anyone else, he should not expect mercy. The mage looked at the protagonist in shock, after which he bowed before the protagonist again, thanking him. Lloyd stood with his back to him, pressing his lips together. He imagined the image of the swordsman behind the mage. Lloyd noted that in the novel, Xavier forgave Ruffalin and left the cave. The protagonist presented the image of the disfigured mage, noting that Ruffalin then killed hundreds more innocent people and experimented on himself, and he turned into an uncontrollable and annoying villain who challenged Xavier again and again. Lloyd took a step, noting that even though he knew about it, he now turned his back on him because the mage's face was hidden under the hood. Ruffalin peered out from under the hood with a terrifying look. Lloyd stood with his back to the man. The mage opened his mouth wide, creating a magic circle. He approached the protagonist with a mad smile, preparing to attack him. Lloyd looked behind him, looking at the mage with a frightening look. He asked the man if he had ever forgiven him. Ruffalin looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. The brown-haired man thought that he knew from the very beginning what this would lead to. Xavier attacked the mage, cutting off his head. Ruffalin's head bounced off the air. The man in the work uniform looked ahead with displeasure. He told the guy that he was nothing but trash, rotten to the core, and when he greeted him, he should bow 90 degrees, asking if he understood. The protagonist noted that there was a dude who constantly swore for no reason. Lloyd remembered himself in his real world when he nervously looked ahead. He noted that it happened every damn time. The brunette bowed to the man, apologizing to him, noting that he would be more careful in the future. The worker told him to keep his back straight. Lloyd noted that there was nothing wrong with that. One should avoid quarrels, one fight leads to another. The man turned his back to the guy, saying that the youth of their day have to be taught everything, and all they themselves know how to do is eat. The protagonist noted that if he was polite, then he would change. With such thoughts, he tried to put up with the situation. A beautiful orange sunset was visible in the sky. Lloyd asked what this led to. The brunette bowed to the man, greeting him. The guy stood motionless in a bent position. The man asked what he was at the demonstration, noting that he almost went deaf. The protagonist noted that he saw him as a punching bag. The man turned his back on the guy, saying how pathetic he was. Lloyd gritted his teeth, thinking that he needed to hold on and it would all be over soon. The guy bared his teeth, thinking that he needed to restrain himself, and if he made a scene himself, he would only suffer more and he needed to relax. The worker stood with his back to the guy, saying that only a worthless mother could have such a worthless son. The protagonist widened his eyes in rage. The guy put his hand on the man's shoulder, after which he bared his teeth and swung his fist. The brunette hit the man in the face. The workers looked back, watching what was happening, not understanding what had happened. Lloyd punched the man in the face, after which he hit him again. The brunette kicked the man in the stomach. He noted that while he was hitting him, there was only one thought in his head, that he was doomed. The workers ran up to the guy, stopping him. The guy was carrying pipes on his shoulder. Lloyd asked what the result was. The guy looked ahead in surprise. The man looked at the protagonist with horror. Then he turned his head to the side. The brunette stood motionless, looking at the man leaving. The protagonist noted that peace had come. The protagonist turned his back to the dead body of the magician. He noted that sometimes he should stop any violence, wondering if everything would be okay then. The protagonist recalled the news on TV. He noted that there were a lot of serial killers and rapists in Korea, wondering why the most vicious criminals escaped punishment, and perhaps it was all about human rights. Ruffalin's head was lying on the ground. Lloyd thought it was funny, but then the villain should get what he deserved. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. The guys were walking along the road in the forest. The man was carrying a backpack on his back with an exhausted look. The protagonist looked back. The worker looked at the young gentleman in surprise. The brown-haired man said to give him his load before he collapsed. The man began to refuse the offer. The protagonist narrowed his eyes, saying that if he felt bad, he would have to carry both of them, so he should give it to him quickly. The sun's rays were breaking through the trees. The young master said that all the men should quickly hand him their backpacks, noting that this was an order. The workers looked at the young master in confusion, saying that they would carry them themselves, and how could such a noble man do this? The protagonist threw the backpacks on his back, saying that whoever was the most troublesome would not receive additional pay. Tears appeared in the worker's eyes. Xavier watched what was happening in bewilderment, thinking that he did not know whether they made it in the backpacks themselves or that he was genuinely concerned about the well-being of the soldiers, and he did not understand him at all. The soldiers looked at the young master with touched expressions. The knight thought that the truth was not important to the soldiers now. Lloyd carried the backpacks with a serious look. The swordsman thought that a leader they could trust and follow. That's what the soldiers thought of young Master Lloyd. The system announced that the freed soldiers were deeply touched by his actions, and after some time, stories about him would be passed on by word of mouth. The protagonist pursed his lips. The system asked if it wasn't lovely. The protagonist looked ahead irritably, asking what was lovely, noting that he didn't need anything except money. The weather was clear above the orc tribe. The iron doors to the stone cold storage were open. Harach looked around the room with curiosity, saying that this was the cold storage. The chieftain's son looked up uncertainly. He looked behind him, saying that it was only slightly cooler there than outside and the meat would quickly spoil, and their muscles would lose their former strength. Lloyd said that it was only for now, and that was obvious. The protagonist smiled widely, noting that it was because there was no ice and they weren't done yet. The chieftain's son looked at the young master in confusion, saying that he knew what ice was and it was hot there, so there was no ice there. The brown-haired man smiled widely, saying that if not, they could make it themselves. Harach frowned in confusion, looking at the brown-haired man, asking how. The young master continued to smile, saying that whatever. Harach looked at the protagonist warily. The brown-haired man continued to force a smile onto his face. The orc narrowed his eyes, wondering if he had brought home a crook and maybe the story about the queen was a lie. The protagonist smirked slightly. The system notified that Harach was not as stupid as he thought. Lloyd said for the system to close, and he never ever thought that it was just her thoughts. The system said that it was not at all, and it was he who thought he was stupid. Lloyd noted that the level of sympathy was still much more important, or rather, the client was more important. Harach began to shake his head from side to side. He thought that Lloyd had saved him, and he should not have thought badly of him. The young master waved goodbye to the orc. The chieftain's son said that if he needed help, he could call at any time. The protagonist told him not to worry and wait until the work was finished. Xavier looked at the protagonist with curiosity, asking where they would get ice. Lloyd stood motionless with his hand raised, after which he looked back in confusion, saying that he was also interested in where. Xavier looked at the protagonist in bewilderment, noting that these were the eyes of a man who did not know what to do. The knight looked at the young gentleman with concern, asking him that he had signed a contract without a concrete plan and that he was going to cheat them. The swordsman's eyes widened in surprise. Lloyd asked if he knew the first signs of failure. The protagonist slightly opened his mouth, saying that he couldn't do this, he couldn't do that. He held his hand out in front of the knight, saying that there would definitely be a lot of reasons, so there was no need to act like that, and that without trying, you wouldn't know if it would work or not. The protagonist looked at the swordsman with a confident look, saying that the one who would succeed would be the one who would be open to everything new and try to fix the situation. Lloyd clenched his hand into a fist, saying that he called this innovation. The young gentleman raised his fist, noting that these were the thoughts of a true entrepreneur. The brown-haired man stood motionless in front of the swordsman. Xavier looked at the guy with indignation, thinking that this was impossible and that such an undertaking had a higher chance of failing. A full moon was visible in the night sky. The protagonist looked thoughtfully ahead while sitting on a rock. The protagonist closed his eyes, thinking that everything was right and that he would first make a huge ice cube. Lloyd imagined Belle and Peepodong pouring water into a container. He noted that Peepodong and Belle would first bring water from the lake. The protagonist imagined the image of a magician who had conjured ice. He noted that ice magic existed in this world, wondering what its principle was. The brown-haired man rested his head on his fist. He thought about magic and the free use of mana and a technique based on freely changing the flow of mana. The brown-haired man imagined the image of a particle of magic. He noted that he was sure that this was possible due to daily training in absorbing mana and that there were several types of natural mana. Orange particles of mana moved in space. A bright flash of mana occurred in space. The protagonist noted that in this way, changes depended on the nature of mana. The young master pressed his lips together, after which he grinned mischievously, thinking that of course he couldn't use mana as he wanted. Peepodong and Belle were moving towards the protagonist, who was calling them. Lloyd leaned towards the water container, thinking that he could do something similar. The young master dipped his hand into the water, thinking about a Srahan's mind technique, absorbing mana. The protagonist spread his fingers in the water, noting that if he took away all the heat energy, then only cold energy would remain in the water. Blue particles of energy floated towards the young master's palm. Lloyd noted that he did everything the other way around, and it wasn't that easy. Xavier leaned towards the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. He watched the scene intently, thinking that he was being open-minded and trying to fix the situation, and he thought he was being unreasonable. The knight pursed his lips, thinking that he was also being irresponsible. The protagonist was gathering magic particles with a concentrated look. The swordsman noted that he was really trying to find a way out with dignity. Xavier sighed heavily, thinking that he couldn't understand him. A blue aura began to emanate from the protagonist. The system notified that he had developed a new skill thanks to a Srahan's mind technique. The system notified that the level had increased, a Srahan's mind technique double rings level 2. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. A couple of days later, Akuch and Harach looked at what was happening in surprise. There were ice cubes in the room. The chieftain asked what he had gotten the ice from. The brown-haired man tapped his hand on the ice, saying that everything would be ready as soon as they installed the insulation. The orcs looked at the ice happily. Akuch noted that there was a lot of space there and they would no longer have to throw away meat. Harach noted that they would no longer have to hunt every day. Lloyd watched what was happening with a satisfied grin. The chieftain said that they should celebrate and that Harach should gather the people. The chieftain's son said that it was wonderful. The young gentleman looked at the knight with a sly grin, after which he raised his index finger, thinking that these were the thoughts of a true entrepreneur. Xavier closed his eyes and spread his arms out to the sides, noting that he was not arguing. The weather was clear above the orc tribe. The chief said that their Steel Sand tribe thanked him. The protagonist slightly bowed, saying that there was no need for gratitude and that he was only following the terms of the contract. Lloyd Frontier got 120 workers. Akuch pressed his fist to his chest, saying that they, orcs, were different from humans, and they did not do this for the sake of a contract. Thole looked at the guy with a serious look, noting that because they were sincerely grateful to him, that is why he, Akuch from the Steel Sand tribe, promised him. The chief stood in a pompous stance, saying that from now on, the Lloyd Frontier family and the Steel Sand tribe. The orcs showed off their muscles, clenching their hands into fists. Akuch said that he was announcing an alliance that was stronger than blood ties. The boys looked at the orcs in confusion. The chieftain looked at the young master with a confident look, noting that they proclaimed Frontier as their friend, Frontier's enemies were their enemies, and if he needed them, he should just call and they would come. The protagonist looked at the system window in surprise. The system notified that the tribe had become available and the orc tribe had accepted him as a true friend. The system notified that he could strengthen his kinship by using the orc's RP, bonus RP for opening the tribe plus 100, the amount of RP was 611. The protagonist's mouth dropped open in surprise. He clenched his fist and smiled broadly, saying that the Steel Sand tribe was cool. White clouds floated above the ground. Lloyd noted that they had once again set off on a long journey and returned home. The villagers watched the events in shock. The protagonist noted that, of course, the people were shocked. The protagonist was walking in the company of orcs. He noted that watching 120 units of living muscle come to the village. The young gentleman smiled in confusion, thinking that he should write an official appeal to calm the people down, because most often orcs are seen in a bad light. The protagonist's parents watched the crowd of orcs in horror. The young gentleman noted that even though the Baron was aware of his wanderings, he froze in place as soon as he saw the orcs in person. The system notified that the wonderful story of defeating the magician and saving the soldiers had spread throughout the area and the inhabitants of the estate were praising him for his noble courage. The system notified that he had received bonus RP for achievements in Society plus 300, the amount of RP is 911. The young gentleman noted that besides, he did not even hope to receive a bonus, and he asked to stop praising him, but thank for the RP, there were vials of liquids on the table. The protagonist noted that the Baron said that he would look for a rich buyer to sell what they got from the orcs and only the magic things of Ruffalan remained. The protagonist looked at the golden sphere with curiosity, after which he began to dig into the book. Xavier asked if he found anything that could be sold. The protagonist said that he did not know, and he was trying to figure out if they could use them as something before selling them. The protagonist looked at the book in shock, wondering what it was, after which he abruptly jumped up, saying that he urgently needed to go to the mines and let him clean up after him there. The protagonist ran along the road to the mines. He began to frantically look around, asking where Thords was. Thords approached the protagonist with an exhausted look, asking what he was looking for. The young gentleman said that he had good news. The guy looked at the young gentleman with an exhausted look. Lloyd asked if he remembered the details of their contract and that he would have to work for him for 520 years. The worker said that he remembered. The brown-haired man smiled widely, asking in fact, what was the point of this, noting that all these conditions were too ridiculous. Thords looked at the brown-haired man in surprise. The protagonist said that now he had nothing to worry about. The hero pointed to the book, saying that it said how to revive a dead person. Thords looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. The main character smiled widely, saying that this meant that he would still be able to work the entire term, asking if he was happy and wasn't it fun. The guys stood motionless, looking at each other. Lloyd looked at the guy with a terrifying look, asking what was funny only to him, ordering the guy to smile. The worker looked at the young gentleman in a daze, after which he smiled widely as tears flowed from his eyes. The young gentleman winked at the guy, telling him not to be so sad. Lloyd walked to the exit raising his fist up, telling him to be cheerful. The system announced that the King of Hell himself was impressed by his efforts and was already thinking of offering him a job. Lloyd told him to slam it shut, asking what was so funny about it. The protagonist walked with a wide smile. The system agreed with the protagonist. White clouds floated above the estate. The brown-haired man walked along the corridor of the building, thinking that now he needed to discuss something with the Baron. The main character looked into the room, wondering why he was not there. The maid approached the young gentleman, saying that the Baron was receiving guests in the hall. Lloyd asked about the guests. The protagonist stared at the servants. The girl said that Mr. Shalo and Meatloaf were there. The protagonist continued to stare at the girl, after which his face twisted into a mad smile. The girl wondered what was wrong with his face. There was a beautiful candlestick hanging on the wall. Meatloaf said that as he already knew, he usually did not require the principal amount of the debt to be repaid in a lump sum. Arcus sat opposite the men, leaning slightly. Meatloaf said that, however, this time they could allow him to pay 10% of the debt. Meatloaf smiled maliciously, saying that if he transferred the ownership of the mine to them. The Baron looked down nervously. The man asked why he was silent, noting that for him this was the best offer. The Baron looked at the door in surprise when the protagonist said it was him, asking if he could come in. Arcus said that he could, of course, come in. The protagonist with a wide smile and looked into the room, saying what kind of meeting is this, asking how they are doing. The man with a displeased face showed the paper to the protagonist, said that if he came to threaten them again, then it is better for him to leave immediately since they have permission. The brown-haired man said that who would doubt it and how smart it is. The young gentleman smiled widely, saying that it can be concluded that they complained with a very good offer, asking nothing if he makes a counteroffer. Meatloaf looked at the guy with irritation, said that he is not going to listen to this idiot. The protagonist said that in the future they will pay off the debt in installments, but of course they cannot lower the interest. The enraged man pointed his finger at the protagonist, saying that he does not want to listen, asking how dare he. The main character smiled widely, asking what can be offered, but he cannot, adding that he is furious. An orc's leg appeared in the room. An enraged Harach appeared behind the protagonist, asking who had angered his brother Frontura. Meatloaf and Shalo looked at Harach in horror. The chieftain's son incinerated the men with a furious look. He said that the Steel Sand tribe would destroy anyone who made Frontura suffer. Lloyd smiled widely, lightly hitting the orc on the chest. He asked his friend what he was talking about, noting that nothing terrible had happened. The chieftain's son said that it hadn't happened at all, and that he looked angry. The protagonist noted that the man had simply raised his voice a little. Shalo and Meatloaf were shaking in horror. Lloyd told them to ignore him, asking how they liked his offer. The young master continued to smile, saying that if they refused him. Harach looked at the men with a terrifying look, while the protagonist smiled madly. The brown-haired man said that he would be deeply offended. Harach said that if they dare to upset Lloyd, he would tear them apart. The two men ran out of the estate in horror. The protagonist held a paper in his hands, looking at it. He said that he would like to make it so that there would be no more for a long time, but this is impossible, so he must be content with what he has. The Baron thanked the protagonist. The young master looked at the defense with a smile, saying that orders for the construction of the system are growing, and coal mining is in full swing, and they will be able to quickly pay them off. Brown-haired handed the paper to Arcus, noting that he should not lose this contract. Arcus looked at the protagonist in surprise. The hero said that they have worse problems, and if they do not solve them, then they will have a hard time. Brown-haired pointed his finger at the chieftain's son, saying that the orcs consume 10 times more food than they do. Arcus looked at the protagonist in horror. The young gentleman noted that their food expenses were no joke, but they would not be able to let them go. The menacing orc swung the poker. The protagonist noted that, as he had expected, orcs made excellent miners. The orc struck the ground with a furious blow. The worker pointed the orc out to the protagonist. Lloyd asked where he was. The worker said that this orc, he works non-stop for 24 hours. The soldiers began to drag the orc away. The protagonist told them to take him away from there and make sure he didn't show up there until tomorrow. The orc screamed that he didn't want to rest and wanted to work until his muscles weakened. The young master noted that their productivity was 10 times higher than he expected, and their endurance and strength were beyond description. Harach looked at the protagonist in surprise, asking what he was talking about money, noting that orcs didn't need money. The protagonist noted that they didn't even have to pay money every month, however. The chieftain's son slapped his stomach, saying that he just needed to feed them enough. The protagonist noted that this wasn't exactly a common problem. The brown-haired man sat on the couch and noted that they would have to raise taxes very much. The Baron looked at the protagonist in confusion. Shaitan said that they would buy orc meat with this money. Considering the productivity of the mines, they would not go into the negative. Arcus said that he understood him. Then he looked down at the floor, adding that one could not be sure that the inhabitants of their settlement would be able to afford it, noting that it was very difficult to make a decision, and they could not charge such a high tax. The hero smiled slightly, saying that if they constantly raised the tax, it would be robbery. What were they losing? Because they would work hard, and they could suffer losses if the amount of tax paid decreased. The Baron looked at the protagonist with curiosity, asking how exactly they would raise taxes then. Shaitan said that everything was simple and they would allow them to earn more money. The protagonist presented an image of a swamp, saying that the abandoned land in the north of the settlement, they would turn the Marez wetlands into a farm. The young gentleman smiled confidently, raising his index finger. He said that they would give it to the people and they would grow different crops, make a lot of money and pay taxes. There was a beautiful orange sunset in the sky. The protagonist stepped on the water. Lloyd and Xavier walked through the swamp. Xavier noted that it had been several hundred years since this land was abandoned, asking how people would be able to grow anything in such a place. The brown-haired man said that his big boss had an idea. The guy grinned in confusion, thinking that he said so, but it would not be easy. The protagonist was sitting near the sand filled with water. He noted that many things need to be taken into account, because the territory is not small and they need to come up with a system for carefully draining rainwater. The protagonist made small walls out of sand, noting that there was no other choice and would have to simulate a possible option. The protagonist was sitting in the middle of water and land. Lloyd asked what if he did this, noting that it was a failure. The young gentleman asked what might be too high, and then perhaps like this, noting that he had messed up again. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. The protagonist was assembling a tower out of the ground with an exhausted look. The Baron and Xavier were watching what was happening. Arcus asked how many days had passed. The swordsman noted that it had been 21 days. Xavier looked at the Baron and said that he barely ate or slept, asking what he should leave him. Arcus said that there was no need to do that. The protagonist stood with a shovel and a bucket in his hands. Arcus said that he hated him, even though he was his son, and wondered if he would ever become a normal person and whether it was impossible. The protagonist pursed his lips, bending over to the ground. The Baron noted that now, for the sake of others, he was trying to bring about amazing changes. Arcus looked down with a sad look, saying that perhaps he could not help him in any way, but he was not going to interfere either. Xavier watched the protagonist closely, saying that it was a wise decision and right now, young Master Lloyd was responsible for his words and would not give up. The protagonist bared his teeth, looking at the ground with a serious look. The system notified that the level of sympathy and Baron Arcus for him increased. He received 20 RP level 931. The leaves on the trees rustled in the wind. The protagonist fell to his knees, after which he clenched his hand into a fist and raised it up. The young master clenched his teeth, raising his hands up. He noted that it should absorb, and then the water would drain as it should. The brown-haired man imagined falling gold coins, thinking that if they dealt with the water, they would be able to raise taxes. The brown-haired man imagined honey pouring on him. He thought about heavenly life. The protagonist stood motionless with his hands raised, after which he collapsed to the ground. Lloyd smirked, noting that he was exhausted, but it was bearable, and if you compare it to how he worked at night and got by with part-time jobs. Lloyd looked at the system window in shock. The system notified that his unusual experience had affected the design skill and a new skill was available to him. The protagonist looked at the system window with curiosity. It said that the design skill, Personal Choice 3, Modeling Mode, and modeling is possible by manipulating the collected data. A green diagram appeared in front of the young gentleman. He picked up a piece of land on the diagram with his hands. After that, stones fell from the top of the diagram. The brown-haired man looked at the system window in fury. The system window notified that he himself said that it was bearable. The protagonist said that he should have told him earlier because he was there for a month, adding that he meant it, asking if he knew how hard it was for him. The system notified that the skill can be visible due to the acquired wisdom. In this case, the reason was his desires. The protagonist squinted at the system window. He asked that when he first appeared there, what was his desire? Lloyd told him to just be honest, asking that he himself did not know and how his desire was connected with his appearance in this world. The young gentleman looked ahead in bewilderment. He said that he just wanted to graduate from college, get a license, get a job in a good company and not think about money, asking that is not what he wanted. The system notified that this is just his goal, and desire is much stronger, something that overcomes space and time. The main character slightly rose, shaking off the dust from his clothes. He said that if he was going to talk about the transience of life, it would be better to stop this conversation because right now he is busy. Lloyd opened his mouth when Belle and Peapodong appeared on his shoulders. The protagonist called out to the guys. Lloyd looked at Belle with a smile, asking that maybe it was time to meet new friends. A bright sun was visible behind the mountains. The protagonist stood near the swamp, saying that this was the first step of their project. The rodent and the snake looked at the protagonist in shock. The young gentleman said that they needed to pump out all the water from there. The rodent began to wave its paws nervously. Lloyd asked that the two of them couldn't handle it, noting that, of course. The brown-haired man put the small snake on the ground, saying that it meant that they would draw. The guy looked into the distance with a confident look, noting that he would use all his RP and draw as many creatures as he could. A system window appeared in front of the protagonist. The brown-haired man said to show it. Random selection of a mystical creature, one choice equals 100 RP. The protagonist thought that since the price would increase by 1.5 times with each choice, he would be able to get 4 creatures. The main character pressed the start button, noting that he did not need any special skills. The young gentleman stood with his back turned, noting that it would be better to have huge creatures like Peapodong and Belle pump out the water, adding that it was somehow loud. The main character began to speak in an incomprehensible language. A green magic circle appeared in the air, from which a head appeared. A creature flew out of the magic circle, after which it hit the main character in the face. A small yellow ball bounced on the ground. A small hippopotamus stood on the ground, looking at the main character. The young gentleman looked at the creature in shock, asking not to tell him that it was a hippopotamus. Peapodong and Belle looked happily at their new friend. The small hippopotamus smiled widely, waving its paws. The animals began to circle happily. The main character leaned towards Hippo, saying that he did not want to distract them, asking if he could show him the instructions. Hippo spat out the paper from his mouth. Lloyd noted that he had already gotten used to it. The protagonist unfolded the wet leaf. He narrowed his eyes, asking that it would not grow even if fed a sunflower seed. Hippo looked at the protagonist with a joyful smile. Lloyd wondered if he had really missed something this time. The hero crossed his arms and looked thoughtfully at the animal, and it smiled at its new owner. Lloyd turned away and said that he would like to try again. Notice, the choice of a fantasy creature is available only once a day. The guy disappointedly muttered that he had only wasted his time. Peapodong and Belle stood up for their little friend, saying that the aristocrat was behaving rudely. The guy sat down next to them and explained that there was only more work to do, and Hippo was too small to be useful. The hamster and the snake actively protested. The hero hastened to calm them down. He looked at the new pet and asked what skill it had and if it could absorb at least the moisture from his clothes. A sign appeared above the creature, skill 1 time, level 1. The boy leaned forward and asked if the beast could really absorb water at once. He wondered how much. Hippo patted his stomach with a smile, and the brown-haired boy guessed that it meant 4 times the capacity of his stomach. Lloyd smiled tightly and looked away, thinking that he had gotten all the necessary skills so far. You could say he was lucky. The animal attracted attention and went to the water to demonstrate the skill. It bent down and began to drink. The boy stood and watched patiently along with the other 2 creatures. The boy raised his eyebrows questioningly. The pet had grown larger. The hero squinted, trying to figure out if he was imagining things. Hippo continued to drink. With each sip, the baby became larger. The brown-haired man gradually raised his head, looking at the animal. Now it had reached a colossal size, and there was almost no water left. Hippo rose and exhaled. In front of them was a dried-up crater where a fish was splashing pitifully. The guy stared ahead in amazement, not understanding how such a quantity of water could be drunk in such a short period of time. That meant they could dry it all up in a couple of days. Peapodong and Belle chuckled arrogantly, showing the owner how wrong he was. The young man smiled awkwardly and apologized to the system as well. He asked if the choice was really random, since only the skills he needed appeared as if by a click. The message said that when the hero first appeared in this world, his skills appeared one after another. Since his role as a person with an unenviable fate could bring him too much trouble, he must have developed the draw for luck skill. However, that might not be the case. The boy looked at the system window and muttered that the system was somehow negligent in explaining. Hippo looked at the owner and squeaked. The hero asked if he really wanted to drink more. The brown-haired man looked up decisively and allowed him to drink as much as he wanted because their construction starts tomorrow. The water was gradually draining. The boy planned to start the construction with the vertical drainage method. The workers looked up at the huge animal in shock. First, Hippo would pump out all the water from the swamps, then drain it into the river and become small again. Then the workers would loosen the soil and remove the roots and remains of plants. The men worked hard, and Xavier stuck his sword into the ground using an explosion. Next, they needed to dig holes where they would insert bamboo poles. They would need to make sand pegs and ask Peapodong to compact the earth. As soon as the water collected inside the bamboo poles, it would be time for Hippo's powerful blow. Then they would build a more reliable storage facility using his modeling skill. The work was in full swing under the command of the aristocrat. And so 10 days passed. The first part was completed. The hero raised his hand and shouted that they still had a long way to go. But when the work was done, they would have a party, so they had to try hard. The workers happily supported their boss and got motivated. A cicada was chirping on a tree, and Xavier, all sweaty and half naked, stood and looked at the field. The guy leaned on a shovel and thought that this abandoned area was really turning into farmland. He looked at the tool with displeasure and wondered since when he started working on a construction site. It seemed like there was another task. The knight looked at the gentleman running up. Lloyd handed him a bag of seeds and ordered him to plant them, starting from that end. The interlocutor asked why the knight should do this. The young man answered that it was to drive away various pests and protect the estate. The blonde agreed. The swordsman squatted down and watered the beds. He looked ahead with an empty gaze and thought that he had been interrupted again. Next time, the guy decided to make an excuse. The knight turned around at the voice, noting that the swamps were indeed turning into rice farms. The baron and his wife approached the guy. The man said that he was sure that people had heard about this. It was some kind of miracle. In front of them were fields where tired but cheerful people were working. The protagonist walked nearby, supervising and directing. Notification: the people of Frontera show their admiration and respect for the miracles you have created. You will be awarded a decent amount of RP as a bonus for success in society. Receive plus 450. Amount of RP 1281. The young man grinned contentedly, throwing the shovel over his shoulder. Dragonflies flew above him, and clouds lazily floated across the sky. Sprouts appeared from the ground. Xavier sat down with a watering can and, looking at the plants, smiled with satisfaction. Lloyd sat next to him, crossing his legs. He said that everything would be ready as soon as they installed the water wheel. The knight looked at him and asked again. The hero smiled and said that during the rains the water would have to be put somewhere, otherwise their lands would be flooded. He went down to the beds and added that they needed a specialist. The interlocutors turned questioningly at the sound. People on horseback were approaching them. The hero looked at them indifferently and asked who it was. The knight answered that it was Viscount Racona. His estate was north of these swamps. The horse stopped, and the man, riding closer, asked who was responsible for this construction. Xavier frowned and made a remark to him to speak more politely. The hero stopped him with a smile and replied that he was the boss here. The boy asked why they had come. The man frowned and said that these lands belonged to Viscount Racona and ordered them to leave this place immediately. The boy and his swordsman looked at the newcomers with displeasure. The Marez Swamps. This place had been abandoned for several hundred years. In the north, these lands are in the possession of Viscount Racona, and the southern part of the swamps belongs to Frontera. It is obvious that he is not just laying claim to them. Apparently, the nobleman wanted to take possession of the fertile lands. The hero narrowed his eyes and thought that the man could really insist on transferring the lands for his use, because in fact, the northern part belonged to him. He grinned and added mentally that it had been like that until now. The hero stood in front of the guests. The boy clarified whether the Viscount was really claiming that they had entered his territory without permission. The nobleman's subordinate frowned and confirmed that these lands had been granted to the Viscount by the king himself. Lloyd frowned and said that the conversation should be conducted between people of equal status and suggested that the interlocutor shut up. The man's face distorted with anger. The workers stared at them in shock, and the Viscount grimaced. The brown-haired man bowed and apologized for not introducing himself earlier. He said that he was the eldest son of the Frontera family. Racona raised an eyebrow and said that he had heard that the young man was behaving inappropriately. The man demanded that the hero call his father. Xavier frowned and thought that this was too rude, but Lloyd calmly began to pick his ear. The interlocutor repeated the order, but the young man said that he heard perfectly well. He blew on his finger and muttered that some kind of dung fly buzzed here. Racona looked around for the insect, and the servant whispered to him that he was the one who was insulted. The protagonist stopped smiling and said that the Land Law of the Kingdom, Act No. 321, a special law responsible for the cultivation of marshland. The man looked at the young man with displeasure and demanded that he stop immediately. The brown-haired man continued quoting Article 1, the purpose, cultivation of marshes that had been abandoned for a long time, establishing property rights to these lands. The interlocutor leaned forward and became indignant, but the young man did not stop. He closed his eyes and reported on the second article, the definition. Abandoned lands are those on which no one has lived for the past 100 years and where no crops have been grown. Article 3, property rights. Lands that meet all the requirements stated above pass into the possession of the one who cultivates them. The young man raised his finger and said that, firstly, their money and labor were invested in these lands. Secondly, housing for people can be built on these lands. Thirdly, the development of long-term agriculture is possible. The man gritted his teeth in displeasure and sweated. The hero stepped forward and shoved his hands into his pockets to name the fourth point. He grabbed a bunch of grass and pulled an onion out of the ground. The boy said that all this was backed up by a special rule when the first harvest had already been reaped from these lands. Rakona looked at him in rage. The knight stared at the gentleman in amazement, remembering how he had said that the seeds would help repel pests. The youth smiled and congratulated the Viscount on witnessing the first harvest in the Merez swamps. He added that there was no charge for viewing. They were not that greedy. The interlocutor grimaced and ground his teeth, not understanding how this idiot knew all this, and whether he had prepared in advance. The boy thrust the onion at the man and generously allowed him to take it as a gift. Lloyd looked menacingly at the nobleman and demanded that he leave their territory. Rakona was shaking with anger, but he said nothing. The ill-wishers turned and rode away while the young man stood and watched them go. Xavier approached him and asked how the gentleman knew that these people would come here. The hero narrowed his eyes and muttered that he had seen such smart guys before who tried to rise on the labor of others. They turned around, hearing a cry of jubilation. The workers joyfully raised their pitchforks and rakes, shouting that the young master had protected their lands. The boy grimaced in irritation and asked where they thought he should get the money for their wages. Lloyd ordered them to quickly get back to work. It was pouring rain, and streams of water flowed down the ditches. The hero sat, not paying attention to the fact that he was wet. Summer was over, and autumn had come, and with it the rains. The mill turned the water. He had used the modeling 100 times, but it was too early for him to relax. An umbrella opened above the young man. The boy thought that he should be completely sure that the lands of Merez were truly fertile. The knight held an umbrella over him. Finally, the sun came out. There was no water left in the dug holes. The hero and his swordsman looked at the fields that were not damaged by the downpour. Notification: knowledge in the field of monumental construction has been acquired. You have left a significant mark on the civil engineering of the continent of Laurasia. As a reward, you have received great experience. Measurement, intermediate level 3, land valuation, underground scanning. Design, intermediate level 3, blueprint visualization, terrain layout, simulation mode. The hero rose from the ground. Baron's sympathy level +5. Baroness's sympathy level +5. Xavier's sympathy level +3. Baron's sympathy level +2. People's sympathy level +3. RP 1355. Lloyd smiled and said that they could proceed to the next step. At this time, in the lands of Viscount Rakona, the man slammed the table and asked again about land reclamation. The subject standing opposite him cringed and said that they would be exempt from paying taxes for 3 years. In exchange, they would be required to live in those lands, so they would not be able to leave. The nobleman frowned and muttered that it meant that the inhabitants of those lands would be actively cultivating them for the next 2 years, since he was the owner and the land was his. He thought with regret that the Merez swamps promised mountains of gold. Rakona clutched his stomach, which was twisted with worry, and remembered that this was part of his land. The man decided that he would not give it up so easily. He looked at the manager and, frowning, ordered a council to be convened. A couple of days later, the protagonist sat up in bed, clutching his head. The boy opened his eyes and wondered why his head was splitting. Maybe it was just fatigue. Lloyd sat up and thought that it was not the time to lie around here because they were organizing and distributing. The knight sleeping in the chair shuddered when his master called him to work. The boy looked warily at the swordsman and asked why he was so confused. It seemed that knights could get tired too. The blonde rubbed his forehead. He frowned and muttered that he had never felt like this before. His head hurt like it was going to split. The brown-haired man put his hand to his temple and frowned. The boy grimaced, realizing something. Testimony of the Baron's maid Emily. The girl touched her temple and muttered that she had a very bad headache since this morning. Testimony of a farmer from the village of Alaf. The man closed his eyes and said that he and all his household members, and even the children, were suffering from headaches. Testimony of a boy named Mihail, who looks after the cows on the farm. The young man looked at the animals with concern and said that the cows had not been drinking since yesterday, and that dehydration was not far away. The hero and the knight were walking down the street. The boy thoughtfully touched his chin and muttered that the villagers were complaining, and even the animals were avoiding drinking. The boy frowned and thought that the reason was in the water, as he had assumed. One of the most powerful weapons the boy could use in this world was information. However, after the incident with the giant ants, he realized that events could be happening now that were not in the novel. The brown-haired man expected that Viscount Rakona could lay claim to these lands, so he decided to make some inquiries about him. The main source of income for the Rakona estate is a secret technology for dyeing things, and the same technology is used to dye fruit. The boy grimaced in irritation and muttered the name of the enemy, Frontera Estate. Arcus looked at his interlocutor in shock and asked again. A subject Viscount was sitting opposite him and said that the man understood everything perfectly well. He frowned and demanded that they give them part of the drained Merez swamps, and then they would stop polluting the water. The Baron frowned and exclaimed, "How dare he threaten him now?" The interlocutor grinned and confirmed that it was a threat. The man slammed his hands on the table and said that he would file an official complaint with the royal court. Racona's servant looked at the Baron indifferently and said that perhaps he would even win the case. He leaned forward and, grinning, added that it would take more than 1 year for them to make a decision. Legal expenses, as well as the purchase of drinking water, are not small. The interlocutor asked whether Frontera would be able to hold out for that long. The Baron gritted his teeth but said nothing. The guest stood up and advised the man to make a wise decision. He glanced sideways at the owner as he passed. Arcus turned around and said that his son and their workers had shed blood and sweat draining these swamps. He promised that he would not give up a piece of land to such a scoundrel. The man bowed with a grin before leaving. At that moment, the door abruptly opened, knocking the guest, and the protagonist entered with the knight. The young man smiled and said that he had an urgent conversation with the Baron. Lloyd bowed and said that the parasitic neighbors had decided to spoil their water and he would like to discuss measures to counter them. Racona's servant put his hand to his cheek and exclaimed in displeasure that the guy had just insulted his master. The brown-haired man flinched and said that he had scared him. The hero made a face of horror and asked if the parasitic offspring really understood human speech. The face of the interlocutor was distorted with anger. He held out his sword and shouted that Kernot himself was challenging Lloyd to a duel for insulting a noble knight. A little later, the hero was using educational measures by beating him with a shovel during the duel. The swordsman curled up into a ball and shouted that he was giving in and accepting defeat. The man, in tears, held out his hand and asked him to stop. Lloyd sighed and agreed that he had had enough too. The boy abruptly resumed the beating, declaring that the Baron deserved another lesson for his rudeness. Arcus, smiling happily, said, "Oh, this bully son." The duel was over and he still continues. Xavier glanced sideways at his master and thought that he had never seen such a happy face on his master's face before. Evening of the same day, the enemy estate. The wounded Kernot stood before his lord with his head down. The Viscount looked angrily at the servant and shouted that he had sent him to resolve the issue, not to return like a beaten dog. The man muttered that he was very ashamed. The nobleman thoughtfully twirled his mustache and said that it was even good that the servant returned so beaten. Kernot looked at the gentleman in surprise. The Viscount leaned on his hands and decided that the only chance to deal with the Baron was to file a lawsuit for assault on a nobleman. He bared his teeth and said that 3, even 4 years would be needed for the proceedings. The protagonist stretched his lips into a sinister smile and said that this was exactly what the enemy thought. The young man frowned and resolutely exclaimed that Frontera would not let their efforts go to waste. He raised his shovel, looking at the assembled soldiers and orcs, and shouted that no mercy would be shown to anyone who stood in their way. The guy said that these lands were soaked in their blood and sweat. Lloyd frowned and said that they would protect their territories from their greedy hands. The army loudly supported the gentleman's speech. To begin with, the hero decided to deal with the problem of drinking water and build a reservoir. Using the Hippo skill, they would pump water from where it had not yet been spoiled. Hippo skill, powerful blow, level 3. The animal was pouring out water. The knight looked at the master and said that this was a good alternative, but the hero and his creature would have to forget about rest. The young man agreed, but added that this was a temporary measure. He turned to the swordsman and suggested that they take care of the water supply system. They would build a waterway from the Capua River from the eastern mountains to their estate. Xavier looked at the brown-haired man and noted that it would not be easy. It was worth considering how much effort it would require. Lloyd smiled and replied that they would have to cut back on expenses, and a lot. He turned around and said that they would earn a lot on this construction. The guy threw the shovel over his shoulder and said that it would be 100 times more. A couple of months later, Racona bit his nails in horror. He asked, trembling, how this was possible.